Michael Cohen named names from the Trump Organization during his public testimony before Congress, and now lawmakers have questions for those people.
They want to follow up on exchanges like this with the president's former lawyer. Representative Jackie Speer asked Cohen about Donald Trump's involvement in building a Trump Tower Moscow.
Did Mr. Trump tell you to offer Vladimir Putin a free penthouse?
No, ma'am.
So
that was Felix Sater. It was a marketing stunt.
There's a name, Felix Sater, longtime New York real estate developer and past associate of the president. During testimony like that, Elijah Cummings was presiding. He gestured at times while casually holding his gavel up between his fingers. And now Cummings, along with the head of the House Intelligence Committee, says he's planning to call more witnesses such as Sater.
So NPR congressional correspondent Kelsey Snell's been following all this and joins us now. Good morning, Kelsey.
Good morning.
So Michael Cohen seems to have given Democrats in particular a whole lot of grist for their mill. They are reportedly going to call Felix Sater and others to come testify. What do they want to learn?
Yeah, this is part of a broader strategy that we saw on display a little bit in that open Cohen hearing earlier this week. And they want to build a chain of information, which is kind of what we heard starting in that bit with Speer. Every time Cohen said he didn't have an answer for a question, they asked who in Trump's inner circle did have the answer. And that's when we heard names like Alan Weisselberg, the CFO of the Trump Organization, and David Pecker from the National Enquirer, and even possibly Donald Trump Jr. Now we're seeing them follow through, and the first time we're seeing that is with Sater. In his case, it seems they want to know more about how plans for Trump Tower in Moscow came together. In particular, some members seem very interested in how involved Trump himself was, and if that involvement lasted after he was elected, and if it involved cutting deals with high-ranking Russian officials. So that is likely where they're headed.
So Cohen is also coming back. I mean, he's coming back again for a closed session next week with House Intel, the Intel Committee. Adam Schiff, the chairman of that committee, saying that that they want what they didn't get this week. What more possibly could Michael Cohen provide?
Well, it's important to remember that the Intel Committee has a really different focus from the Oversight Committee, where Cohen was giving that public testimony that we just heard. Oversight is interested in Trump's domestic dealings, things like, the way that he made money and what he did here in the U.S. Intel, they really just care about his interactions with Russia and other foreign entities. And that's part of the reason that their interviews are behind closed doors. It allows the committee to get into classified information and go down paths that relate to the Mueller investigation, all stuff that isn't public yet. So Schiff did say he'd like to make as much of the Sater interview as public as possible, but Cohen, we think, should still remain behind closed doors.
Interesting. So before I let you go, I want to ask you about this report that came out. The New York Times and the Washington Post reporting that President Trump allegedly ordered top secret security clearance for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and that he did this over the strong recommendation of White House counsel Don McGahn and his chief of staff at the time, right?
Right. So the Times is reporting that Trump ordered his then chief of staff, John Kelly, to give Kushner the top secret security clearances. And it was a decision that overruled the assessment of the intelligence community. And they're basing this on what they say is at least one contemporaneous memo. Now, White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders is quoted as saying that the White House does not comment on clearances, but it's already sparked some attention from Democrats. And Elijah Cummings, who we already talked about, the Oversight Committee chairman, already launched an investigation into security clearances. And late last night, he's demanded that the White House comply with his demands for documents and information.
Okay, NPR's Kelsey Snell. Kelsey, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
President Trump says he walked away from a potential deal with North Korea because the North wanted all U.S. sanctions lifted. Here's what he said to Sean Hannity on Fox News.
They wanted to denuke certain areas, and I wanted everything. And the sanctions are there, and I didn't want to give up the sanctions unless we had a real program.
Now, North Korea's foreign minister is giving a different account of this failed summit. He says the North only asked for partial sanctions relief in exchange for shutting down some nuclear sites, and insists the North offered a good deal. Well, how did all this look to North Korea's neighbors, South Korea and China?
Let's ask NPR Shanghai correspondent Rob Schmitz. He's been monitoring the reaction around the region. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Rachel.
So let's start with South Korea, right? Because they have the most to win or lose by a potential nuclear deal. I mean, what's just been the reaction in the past 24 hours?
Well, I think for South Korean leader Moon Jae-in, this outcome puts him in a very difficult spot. He's worked really hard in the past year guiding a sort of a forward momentum with Kim Jong-un, and this has got to be pretty deflating for him. I spoke with John Delury, who's an associate professor at Yonsei University's Graduate School of International Studies, about this, and here's what he said about how South Korea is feeling right now.
The government here really wanted to see more tangible results. I think they would have been happy with what's been called a small deal and some interim steps, to sustain this momentum. So to just kind of walk away with nothing is not good.
And what about China?
Well, in terms of North Korea, Beijing is likely to be fine with the fact that no deal was reached. China's leadership prefers the status quo. North Korea remains a mildly threatening buffer state between China and U.S. troops in South Korea. And a lack of a nuclear agreement keeps North Korea in play when it comes to U.S.-China relations. In other words, Beijing can continue to use its close relationship with North Korea as currency in its negotiations with the U.S. Now, there's another thing that Beijing is likely paying close attention to here, and that's the fact that President Trump walked away from a potential deal. Like North Korea, China's leadership has also been made to believe that they're about to sign a deal with President Trump to end a trade war. Knowing that the president is capable of just walking away like this may give China's leaders pause for thought as they approach an upcoming summit between Xi Jinping and Trump. Will Trump do the same thing if he's not satisfied with them? This trade war has been pretty debilitating for China's economy, so they're not going to want a repeat of what just happened in Hanoi when they meet with Trump later this month.
Right. Meanwhile, North Korea is insisting that they've got a different view of how the negotiations actually broke down, and that, by the way, their position is never going to change. So where does that leave the future of these negotiations?
Yeah, it's interesting to watch look at the North Korean media spin all of this. Remarkable progress was one of their headlines after this summit. They pointed out that Kim and Trump have a very special relationship and that they'll keep working on that. I think one thing to remember here is that Kim Jong-un is still in Vietnam right now. He's still visiting with that country's leaders. And this could be an important country for the type of future that Kim is trying to build for North Korea, which is more economically connected within the region. It's also a long train home ride for Kim. So he's going to make a lot of stops on the way in China, perhaps, including another meeting maybe with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, turning this trip into more of a regional tour.
Okay, NPR's Rob Schmitz. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Michael Jackson was everything to so many people. A child prodigy who became an icon. He was the king of pop. But for the past 25 years, there's been this horrible shadow over his legacy, which is now the subject of a new documentary.
Two men come forward in that documentary, which is titled Leaving Neverland. It airs on HBO this weekend. In this film, Wade Robson and James Safechuck claim that the singer sexually abused them starting around the ages of 7 and 10. They say the abuse went on for years. Michael Jackson's family has been responding to the film, and here's what his nephew Taj told CBS.
It's always been about money. I hate to say it when it's my uncle. It's almost like they see a blank check.
The Jackson estate is suing HBO, calling the documentary a posthumous character assassination.
We've got NPR TV critic Eric Deggans with us this morning. Hey, Eric.
Good morning.
So Michael Jackson has been charged and acquitted of child molestation in the past. What makes this documentary and these accusations different?
Well, this is a detailed look at allegations from Robson and Safechuck, two men who spent many years with Jackson as children and who had once denied that the singer ever abused them. The film centers on these in-depth interviews with them, includes their mothers, their wives, a few other relatives. Robson met Jackson when he was 5 or so in 1987 after winning a dance contest in Australia where he was born. And Safechuck starred in a 1986 Pepsi commercial with Jackson, and both of these men say that Jackson built friendships with them and their families. When he was at the height of his fame, he showered gifts and attention on them while he was secretly abusing them sexually when they were isolated.
So we heard Jackson's nephew argue that this is always all about money. It always has been when it comes to his uncle. How are the filmmakers responding?
Well, Jackson's family also notes that the filmmakers didn't ask them for comment in the film, and that's a big issue with critics of Leaving Neverland. Jackson died in 2009, so he's not around to respond to these allegations himself. The film's director, Dan Reed, has said that he wanted to focus on the only people who could actually know what happened between Jackson, Robson, and Safechuck. I do think another recent documentary that looked at abuse allegations against a music star, Lifetime's Surviving R. Kelly, showed how interviewing a lot of people, including former employees or even psychologists, could add new context to allegations like this and give you a fuller picture.
So, Eric, you've seen this. I mean, I'm a Michael Jackson fan. I grew up with his music. I know you're a Michael Jackson fan, to say the least.
Sure.
So what is it? How's this going to change how we think about his music?
Well, it could change it quite a lot, depending on how much people believe these allegations that are told by Robson and Safechuck. I mean, we're now at a time after Cosby, after Louis C.K., after R. Kelly's arrest, where people are looking back at celebrities who may have avoided consequences for serious wrongdoing in the past, and they're kind of reevaluating the original allegations against them. Now, Jackson was acquitted on child molestation charges. He's not around to speak to allegations, but I do think a film like Leaving Neverland will push some fans to re-examine past stories about his closeness to children and decide for themselves how comfortable they are listening to his music and supporting his legacy.
NPR TV critic Eric Deggans for us this morning. Eric, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Michael Cohen's days of testimony before Congress have ended, for now at least, but congressional investigations of the president have barely begun.
There's a connection between those two things, the testimony and the investigations. Leaders of multiple House committees listened to the president's former lawyer last week, and they heard many leads into allegations of corruption or abuse of power. Gerald Nadler, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, tells ABC he plans to request documents from more than 60 people around the president.
Impeachment is a long way down the road. We don't have the facts yet, but we're going to initiate proper investigations.
The House investigations come alongside the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller, which President Trump attacked on Twitter again yesterday.
All right, NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley is with us. Hey there, Scott.
Good morning, David.
I think we just said the word investigation maybe like a dozen times there in the last. There are a lot of investigations we're talking about, but Nadler, this top Democrat, says that he's going to initiate a proper investigation. What exactly makes his significant?
Well, Nadler chairs the House Judiciary Committee, and that gets your attention because if there were to be an impeachment proceeding against the president, that's the committee where it would start. But you heard that note of caution from Congressman Nadler there. He says it's a long road to get from where we are now to impeachment. And he stressed in that ABC interview that before you'd get to the end of that road, you'd have to convince the American people, including a good number of Republicans, that that was the right path. So that's a pretty tall order. But we are seeing here a pretty aggressive first step on that road with inquiries going out to people in the White House, the Trump Organization, and the president's own family.
Well, Steve mentioned, Michael Cohen's testimony, that there's a link there with House Democrats and their plans. What is the link? Did Cohen give Democrats some really important avenues to pursue that could change things?
Absolutely. You heard lawmakers asking him, who else should we talk to? Who else would know about these things you described? Who could corroborate Cohen's account? Whether it is manipulating financial reports to inflate the president's net worth or decrease his taxes, whether there were signs of campaign finance violations. And then apart from that, apart from the Cohen threads, you have a whole separate investigation going on in the Oversight Committee into the White House process for granting security clearances. Late last week, we had the New York Times reporting that the president had ordered a top-secret clearance for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, over the objection of security professionals. Now, the president has the authority to do that, but that's not the story the White House had been telling about how it played out.
Well, the president is out there, calling Robert Mueller's team angry people, saying this is a witch hunt going after Democrats. He's doing his thing in public. What about internally? Is the White House getting more worried about any of this?
They have staffed up to some extent. There are now people whose jobs it is to answer congressional inquiries, something they didn't have to do a whole lot of during the first 2 years of the administration when the Republicans were in control, and there wasn't a lot of aggressive oversight. But that said, there's also a lot of pushback. For example, in that Oversight Committee inquiry into security clearances, which has been underway for more than a month now, you've had the White House counsel's office saying basically in the most polite terms possible, that's none of your business.
NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley. Scott, thanks.
Good to be with you.
right, 2 police officers will not face criminal charges in Sacramento for fatally shooting an unarmed black man.
22-year-old Stephon Clark was shot 7 times while holding a cell phone during a chase last year. District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said this weekend that the evidence supports the officers' statements that they thought Clark was pointing a gun. The victim's brother is now calling on California's Attorney General to prosecute instead. And his mother, Sequette Clark, spoke with NPR's Michelle Martin over the weekend, and she criticized the local prosecutor's decision to let the officers go.
She never addressed their actions. She presented and painted a picture of my son that was her opinion.
All right, Capitol Public Radio's Ben Adler has been covering this case. Hi, Ben.
Good morning.
Can you just take us back to what happened and remind us of the circumstances of Stephon Clark's death?
Yeah, David, nearly a year ago, Sacramento police responded to reports of a man breaking car windows. Now, the officers pursued him into a backyard. They thought he had a gun, and they fired 20 rounds at him. The man was Stephon Clark. He turned out to be holding not a gun, but a cell phone. And the backyard he had run into was his grandmother's.
So thought he had a gun. Is that really the crux of what the district attorney has concluded here?
Yes, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert said the officers' actions were justified because, as she put it, they honestly, without hesitation, believed he had a gun.
The law requires that we judge the reasonableness of an officer's actions based upon the circumstances confronting them at that moment of time.
And as for Clark, Schubert said evidence from his cell phone showed he feared arrest for domestic violence and that he was considering suicide.
So no charges. That's the news, the announcement from the district attorney, as we've heard. How is the community responding to that?
Well, the DA's decision was no surprise. It was expected, but the details she released about Clark's state of mind infuriated his family and the community. Clark's mother called it a smear campaign, a pastor called it a modern-day lynching, and a woman who lived down the street from where he was killed said it felt like Clark was being charged with his own murder. Protesters shut down the city's largest mall yesterday. Here is activist Barry Axios.
Sacramento, you are now warned that there will be no sleep. We may show up at one of your other communities. We might even show up at the Golden Winery. You never know what could happen.
He was alluding to the protests in the days after the shooting last year that twice shut down the downtown venue here where the NBA Sacramento Kings play.
So we mentioned that the Attorney General's office could get involved here in theory. I mean, that's what some people are calling for. So what exactly does that mean, and what happens next?
Well, in addition to that ongoing investigation, the Sacramento Police Department is waiting for those findings before conducting its own review. The debate is also now moving to the state capitol, where there are rival bills to change the law governing when police can use deadly force. One of those bills backed by community activists and civil rights advocates, the other one backed by law enforcement groups. And so that's going to be a debate that rages on throughout the year.
Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so we might see some real debates in terms of changing the law in cases like this going forward.
I think the political dynamics are such here in California that there will definitely be a law. The question is how far the changes to the law will go.
Capitol Public Radio's Ben Adler reporting for us. Thanks so much, Ben.
Welcome.
So the battle to defeat ISIS in the eastern part of Syria seems to be slowing down.
Yeah, the group has been surrounded by U.S.-backed forces in a town called Baghouz in northern Syria. ISIS fighters, we're told, are resisting as they try to defend what's described as the last pocket of territory they control. And they are allegedly using human shields, according to a spokesman for the Syrian Democratic Forces.
NPR's Peter Kenyon has been monitoring all of this fighting from his post in Istanbul. Hi there, Peter.
Hi, David.
Okay, so what is the latest in terms of the fighting? I know from the Trump administration there have been some declarations of victory and then some backing away from declarations of victory. So how close are U.S.-backed forces to actually claiming a victory here?
It looks like they're pretty close. How definitive, how final this victory may be is what remains an open question, I think. Over the weekend, the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, trying to seize this last square mile of ISIS control, said this is going to be over in a matter of days. but there could still be some intense fighting between now and then. SDF commanders say some of those airstrikes by the U.S.-led coalition targeted vehicle bombs that have been left by ISIS. There was a Twitter post by the SDF spokesman who said 3 car bombs were taken out by the airstrikes. He also tweeted that the battle to retake the last ISIS holdout is going to be over soon. There are estimates hundreds of ISIS fighters are left, promising to keep fighting. It does sound, or at least they're trying to make it sound like, a victory over those fighters is more a question of when rather than if.
I heard someone describe this last bit of territory as maybe the size of like Central Park in New York. Is that accurate? I mean, is that the kind of space we're talking about here?
It's about a square mile, and it's in a town in far eastern Syria on the Euphrates River near the border with Iraq. Coalition forces actually captured this town, Baghouz, last September, but they weren't able to hang on to it. ISIS fighters retook the village. The SDF has listed some of the reasons why the battle hasn't ended yet. Some of these ISIS fighters, they say, are launching sneak attacks from underground tunnels. Besides the car bombs, there are mines, other explosives, and there have been suicide attacks and snipers. So the coalition also says, once again, that they're making every effort to conduct this fight so as to minimize civilian casualties.
So there are things that make it particularly difficult. I mean, to actually get this final bit of territory. I mean, ISIS fighters can really hole up the accusation of human shields, these suicide attacks. I mean, there's a chance that this won't be easy.
Well, certainly. I mean, and if it's a fight to the death, capture or killed, as we're hearing from reports from the ground, obviously that wouldn't go smoothly or necessarily very quickly.
What about civilians, Peter? I mean, this is a question we always ask about all the fighting in Syria. It sounds like there was a 2-week pause here to allow for some evacuations of civilians. Was it successful, and have civilians been freed, and are they out of this area and out of harm's way?
It was successful to the extent that hundreds of people did flee Baghouz. A lot of civilians, also some fighters. One aid group said more than 1,000 may have gotten out. I haven't seen any reports claiming that all civilians have evacuated the area. And the anti-ISIS coalition says they're trying to avoid hitting any civilians that might still be there. The 2-week pause ended Friday, and since the remaining ISIS holdouts basically have nowhere to go, the fighting could be quite fierce. There are plans being made for a victory celebration once Baghouz is retaken. It'll be called a decisive defeat. We'll see what happens after that.
All right, we will see, and you'll be reporting on it. NPR's Peter Kenyon in Istanbul, covering the latest events in eastern Syria. Peter, thanks.
Thanks, David.
Rescue crews in Alabama are searching for survivors. This after the deadliest tornado in the U.S. since 2013.
Yeah, so as of this morning, 23 people are confirmed dead, and at least 3 of them were young children. Winds were topping 170 miles an hour as this tornado tore through rural Lee County near the Georgia state line on Sunday. The destruction area in some places was a mile wide. Now, yesterday, really the only sound was of chainsaws as residents and volunteers were cutting through jumbled piles of wood.
NPR's Southern Bureau Chief Russell Lewis is in the area and went out to see the devastation yesterday. Good morning, Russell.
Good morning.
What'd you see?
Well, it was pretty bleak. You see a lot of roofs that have been, basically ripped clean off, power poles cracked in half. You saw cars that were tossed about like children's toys and shards of yellow insulation just hanging from the shattered pine trees like tinsel on a Christmas tree. I met up with Jennifer Vernon, and, you could see that the shock still had not fully set in for her. She was basically standing in what was left of her neighborhood in Beauregard, Alabama. Her house was just gone.
We've got a few things out, but for the most part, it's all either damaged or wet or not really salvageable.
The tornado in Alabama stayed on the ground for 25 miles, and when it crossed into the border into Georgia, it was on the ground for at least another 15 miles.
Wow. And I understand the tornado came on really quickly, right? I mean, how much advance warning did residents actually get?
About a half an hour or thereabouts. Meteorologists really had warned about the possibility of severe weather in this area really a day in advance. And on the morning of the storm, they began to issue more dire forecasts. I spoke with Chris Darden with the National Weather Service in Birmingham, and, he said that tornadoes this powerful are almost certain to always be deadly.
170-mile-an-hour centrifuge, throwing bricks, debris, 2x8s. They're all spears. They're all, killing machines.
And I know that a lot of people in this area live in trailers and mobile homes, which I imagine are completely vulnerable to something like this.
Yeah, they always are, especially with a storm this violent, this powerful. I spoke with Phil Cheney. He teaches geography at Auburn University, and he's studied this problem. And he says that many people, have to have a tornado plan, but that's, not good enough, actually.
They need to actually go through the steps to see how long it takes so that they understand how much time is going to be required to get to their safe place, so that they have that in their mind when they get the warnings and they know what they're going to do at that point.
So, Russell, families are grieving today over the loved ones they've lost. People are trying to figure out what is left of their lives that have been destroyed, their homes. But this is a season, right? Tornadoes happen in clusters around the year, and it's not over, huh?
No, it's not. In fact, tornadoes can strike at any month of the year, but the worst part of the time in Alabama actually is next month. April is a particularly dangerous month for tornadoes, so there's a lot out there to still be worried about.
NPR's Russell Lewis for us. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, as happens after a natural disaster, a lot of people in Alabama are going to be turning to the federal government for help.
Yeah, and this process is already starting. Alabama's Governor Kay Ivey held a news conference yesterday. She said she had already spoken to President Trump about this.
He asked what he could do, and I said, well, Mr. President, we're working with FEMA to craft a request for expedited disaster recovery declaration, and we'd sure appreciate your support.
Now, a new NPR investigation is revealing inequities in the way FEMA and other federal agencies disperse aid after a disaster. The investigation finds that wealthier people and whites often receive more than minorities and those with less wealth.
NPR's Robert Benincasa and Rebecca Hersher led the investigation, looking at a number of disaster aid programs. And Rebecca is in the studio this morning. Hi, Becky.
Hi.
So your reporting finds that federal aid doesn't always go to those who actually need it most, right? Explain that if you can.
So here's how it happens. The federal government spends a lot of money every year rebuilding and also on preventing future damage. So that's things like giving out money for a down payment on a new apartment, let's say,
right,
or helping you buy a new car, or even buying out properties that have flooded repeatedly so no one else will live there.
Mm-hmm.
So you might assume that money would go to the people with the most need. But actually, the aid is often going to Americans with other safety nets.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how this happens or when?
Yeah. So take low-interest loans. The federal government gives low-interest loans to help families who have lost their belongings in a fire or a flood. But you have to have a certain credit score to qualify. And that's to protect the taxpayer, because if you don't pay the money back, we all do.
Right.
But the problem is people who have more money often are able to maintain a higher credit score.
Right, exactly.
Or let's take disaster buyouts. The federal government will sometimes buy properties with federal and local money after a disaster like floods. The land that the properties were on gets turned into permanent green space. So in the future, no other homes or businesses or potential lives are lost there in a future disaster.
Right, but there's a rub there, right? Because if, let's say, you don't own your home, if you rent your home, then the government can't buy it from you.
Exactly. And here's the other thing. Even among homeowners, white people are more likely to get a buyout. So, NPR's Robert Benincasa, he's my reporting partner on this project. He got a list of properties that the federal government has bought. There are 40,000 of them. And the federal government really didn't want us to see this. Robert filed a Freedom of Information Act request for them. FEMA denied it. NPR sued. We won. And when we got it, Robert linked the zip codes associated with those addresses to census data on demographics. And what we found was that nationally, sales of flood-damaged homes happened most often in places where the population was more than 85% white.
Wow.
Now, for context, the whole country is about 62% white.
Has the federal government weighed in? Have they responded to this?
They have. So we interviewed David Marstead. He oversees FEMA's buyout program. And he said that the program is working if it makes a community less risky, if it saves property, and if it potentially saves lives. It's not designed to consider demographics. And he points out correctly that the federal government doesn't actually choose which properties get offered buyouts. That's local government. That's local governments.
Right, what local communities do. But still, I mean, based on what you've just explained, the system does end up picking winners and losers.
Absolutely. And often it's along racial lines. So I talked to 2 researchers who looked at the whole U.S. at the county level, and they found that on average, Black people tend to lose wealth and white people tend to gain wealth after disasters. And that's even more intense when you look at renters versus homeowners.
Interesting. NPR's Rebecca Hersher for us this morning on this investigation. The results are out today. Becky, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is in some serious political trouble right now.
Yeah, 2 of his cabinet members have resigned, and this came after Canada's Attorney General stepped down last month, and she is now accusing Trudeau of meddling in a criminal prosecution. Even many of Trudeau's supporters are now saying his brand as a popular progressive leader is really taking a beating.
North Country Public Radio's Brian Mann is in Ottawa, Canada's capital, following all this. Good morning, Brian.
Hi, Jill.
How did Justin Trudeau go from having this pretty stellar reputation at home and abroad to getting embroiled in something like this?
Yeah, this shifted so fast, even people here in Ottawa are trying to wrap their arms around it. So here's how it went. Last month, the Toronto Globe and Mail newspaper ran this big expose claiming Trudeau intervened in a high-level criminal probe involving a Canadian company called SNC Lavalin that's been accused of bribery and corruption. According to their story, Trudeau secretly pressured Canada's then Attorney General, a woman named Jody Wilson-Raybould, trying to convince her to go easy on this company. So last week, Wilson-Raybould herself went public, and she told Parliament the newspaper account was true. Here she is.
I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada.
And she went on to point the finger right at Trudeau, saying he was the guy directing this secret pressure as a way to shore up his party's political support.
And now a second member of Trudeau's cabinet has resigned?
Yeah, that's right. Canada's Treasury Board president, a woman named Jane Philpott, wrote a scathing public letter arguing that Trudeau had broken what she called a fundamental doctrine of the rule of law. I should say that Andrew Scheer, head of Canada's opposition Conservative Party, he's no fan of Trudeau. He's now called for the Prime Minister to resign, and he's calling for a probe by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
But what's the motive, Brian? I mean, why, according to the allegations, does Trudeau have some kind of relationship with this company?
This is a big company in Montreal, which is Prime Minister Trudeau's base of political support. And with elections coming, the argument seems to have been that by going fiercely against this company, it would have cost jobs and would have cost his Liberal Party votes in an important part of the province of Quebec.
Wow, interesting. So what is Justin Trudeau saying right now?
So he argues that this was an important and legitimate act for him to take to advocate on behalf of this Canadian company and all of the jobs that it provides. He says he did it in ways that were proper. Here he is speaking with reporters yesterday.
We will do that, however, in a way that respects our institutions, respects the independence of our judiciary. Canadians expect us to do those 2 things at the same time, and that's what we will always do.
I mean, you referenced the fact that there is an election coming up. I mean, how big a hit is he taking right now? Can he overcome this?
Yeah, I'm hearing from all sides that Trudeau's brand is seriously damaged. The super influential Canadian news magazine Maclean's ran an article about the scandal this week titled Justin Trudeau Imposter. So this is a tough time for him. Very dangerous for a guy who seemed bulletproof just a few weeks ago.
Brian Mann with North County Public Radio joining us from Ottawa. Brian, thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
North Korea seems to be rebuilding a missile testing site.
Yeah, it's a missile engine testing stand that North Korea dismantled last year. That was back when it was promoting its interest in denuclearization. But last week, a summit between President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un ended with no deal, and days later, satellite imagery shows this stand has been rebuilt.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn has been following this story from Seoul, South Korea. Hi there, Anthony.
Hey, Steve.
So what was this testing stand part of, and what do the overhead images show?
Well, this is a rocket launch test site called Dongchang-ri on North Korea's west coast. And it had been partially disassembled, and now what satellite pictures are showing are that a rail system to put a rocket on the launch stand, as well as buildings, roofs are being reassembled. Cranes are in sight there, or cranes are on site putting stuff up. So it's a little bit hard to interpret. Intelligence officials and other watchers are not quite sure when this happened. Some believe it happened around the middle of February, so before the Hanoi summit, and could have been working on it as recently as Saturday after the summit concluded. So the concern is that they're heading in the opposite direction of what Kim Jong-un and North Korea had promised, which is dismantlement and movement towards denuclearization.
Appreciate the note of caution here. I guess we should recall satellites do not necessarily, commercially available satellite imagery does not necessarily cover all the world all the time. You may not be able to get a look at a particular site every single day. So we don't know just when this happens, but we do know that it seems to have happened quite recently. And Joseph Bermudez, an expert quoted at NPR.org today, is saying, wow, this seems to have happened within days. Now, how extensive is this complex that seems to be getting rebuilt?
Well, this one itself is not that huge. And also another thing to remember is that a lot of the rockets and missiles, the missiles that North Korea launches can be launched from mobile launchers. So that's not big of a deal. It was part of the package, two things, a nuclear test site and a rocket test site that Kim Jong-un said that he had begun to dismantle. And therefore, he wanted the U.S. To react, to reward him for this with some sort of sanctions relief.
So, as someone who's watched North Korea for a long time, of course, we can't peer into the heads of North Korean leaders. The question that immediately occurs to us is North Korea going right back to where it was now that this summit has failed? What evidence are we able to look at to try to begin to answer that?
Okay, well, first of all, after President Trump had left Hanoi, the North Koreans gave a press conference in which they said, you know, these partial moves to dismantle our system are all we can offer you right now. And if you're not interested, Kim Jong-un may not be interested in negotiating with you. And he'd also said previously that, if things don't work out, they can do it another way. They can go back to their testing of missiles and nukes. And that is the main concern right here. Okay, so some early evidence that the North Koreans may be moving in the direction they actually did threaten to go. Anthony, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Sure thing, Steve. NPR's Anthony Kuhn. California's Attorney General says he will not prosecute two Sacramento police officers who killed an unarmed black man last year.
Yeah, the decision by Javier Becerra is the same decision made by a local district attorney. Both say police had reason to open fire on Stephon Clark. They said they thought he had a gun. It turned out to be his cell phone. It's the sound of protests erupting after the prosecutor's decisions, and last night, activists disrupted a city council meeting demanding changes to California's use of force law.
So let's talk about that law and the decisions that were made under it with Capital Public Radio's Ben Adler, who's in Sacramento. Hi there, Ben.
Good morning, Steve.
Given what the law says, was the state attorney general's decision a surprise?
No, not really. Becerra, just like the local prosecutor over the weekend, laid out the state and federal laws that govern when police or anyone else really can use deadly force. And basically, it is that you have the right to use it if you're in imminent danger of death. In other words, self-defense. So here is Stanford criminal law professor Robert Weisberg, who says this is long-standing law with additional benefit of the doubt given to police officers.
You're allowed to use deadly force
if it is actually necessary to prevent deadly force from being used against you or others, or if it reasonably appears that it is necessary. And that's the big caveat here.
It's a caveat that infuriates the law's critics because they argue it's just too easy for police officers to avoid accountability.
I guess from the point of view of the critics, police can simply say, I thought I was threatened, and that seems to them to be the end of it. Is that really, though, what the Attorney General says? Does he say he's just taking the police officer's word for it here?
Well, he did lay out specific pieces of evidence that were available from sheriff's helicopter overhead, police body camera videos and audio, and other factors as well. So it's not just based on the police officer's words, but it does play a role here.
So what is it that protesters and critics of these decisions would like the law to say instead?
Well, they want to change the use of force standard from reasonable to necessary. And lawmakers tried to do that last year at the state capitol, but the bill stalled amid some fierce law enforcement opposition. This year there are two bills. The one from last year is back, and for the first time, law enforcement groups have their own proposal. And the law enforcement proposal keeps the reasonable standard, but funds and implements new training. And the argument there is the training will help officers make better decisions under pressure, and that in turn would reduce unnecessary deaths.
Okay, so we have two different possible ways to respond to this shooting, which happened right in the state capital, Sacramento, which you cover, of course, Ben Adler. Is this a situation where California's Democratic-dominated legislature is under pressure to pass something, to change something?
Absolutely. There's a lot of pressure coming to bear, and then there's a lot of people who lead state government saying, yes, we think there need to be changes. Governor Gavin Newsom, Democratic legislative leaders in both chambers, and the Attorney General, Javier Becerra, yesterday saying he was going to be present in that discussion as well. We do think there's going to be pressure for both sides to come to the table and compromise. So something in between reasonable and necessary, which Weisberg, our law professor, says is going to be really tricky to do.
Ben, thanks for the update. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That's Ben Adler of Capital Public Radio in California. Some more news now. For the first time in decades, the FDA has approved a major new drug to treat depression.
Yeah, this is a nasal spray that can relieve symptoms in hours instead of weeks. The medicine is called Spravato, and it's produced by Johnson & Johnson. It's based on the anesthetic ketamine, which has a reputation as a club drug. Now, psychiatrists like Martin Teicher from Harvard Medical School have been using that drug to treat a growing range of disorders.
I think it's actually one of the biggest advances in psychiatry in a very long time. It doesn't work for everybody, but it's sort of remarkable to have a treatment that can work pretty much immediately.
What does that mean for any number of patients? NPR science correspondent John Hamilton is covering the stories in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
First, how is it that an anesthetic would treat depression?
Well, that brings up the question that nobody really understands. Scientists really don't understand how any drug treats depression. These drugs like Prozac, nobody's exactly sure how they work.
They just know that it seems to work for a lot of people.
But it does, right. What they do know is that drugs like Prozac target what's known as the serotonin system in the brain, whereas this drug targets the glutamate system. So it's clearly a different mechanism, and that's why there's so much excitement about it.
Does that mean that this drug might work for people who get no effects from Prozac or other antidepressants?
That's correct. There are about a third of people with major depression don't respond adequately to other drugs, and so you're talking maybe 5 million people out there. And so there are a lot of people who might respond to this who don't respond to others. And studies show that those patients who have failed on other drugs do succeed on this drug.
How do they identify who can use this new drug then?
The test for getting it is that you have to have what they call failed on 2 other antidepressant drugs. And then you are eligible for treatment with this drug.
You've spoken to somebody who knows something about this, I guess.
I have. A few months back, I spoke to a patient who was taking ketamine. So that's the drug that this is based upon. His name is James. He's an advertising executive, and he didn't want us to say his full name because he was afraid it would hurt his career.
My wife took a summer off to be with me because she was scared of what was going to happen to me. She would go to work for a few hours, rush home. There'd be times I'd call her just screaming, "Please come home. I can't get through another minute."
So The thing that intrigued me is that there are a lot of people like James. Depression is a really serious condition. It can be a fatal condition. Many of the suicides that occur in this country are from people who are depressed. So having a treatment is a big deal.
Okay, so this sounds great, but we're talking about, this is a nasal drug, is that right? It's a nasal spray?
That's right. You take this drug as a nasal spray.
So you have a nasal spray, something that's very easy to take, and it's based on this other drug that has a reputation as a club drug. How concerned are people about abuse?
Well, the FDA is very concerned about it. And so the drug company, Johnson & Johnson, that is selling this drug, has taken a lot of steps to make sure that this drug will not get out on the streets, that it will not be abused. So, for instance, if you want to be on this drug, you have to go and take your dose in an approved, a certified clinic where you will be observed. You don't get to take this drug home or anything like that.
Okay. Well, John, thanks for the update. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's NPR's John Hamilton on news of a new anti-depression drug.
President Trump's former campaign chairman could be sentenced to 24 years in prison today.
Paul Manafort is expected in court in Alexandria, Virginia. He faces sentencing in the first case brought to trial by Justice Department Special Counsel Robert Mueller as part of his Russia investigation. Another former associate of the president, Michael Cohen, is due in prison in May, and he spent one of his final days of freedom before a House committee yesterday. He apparently brought documents. He was holding a folder and wheeling a suitcase on his way in. He met in private with the House Intelligence Committee, which is led by Democrat Adam Schiff.
I think the members found it an enormously productive session, and we're very grateful for the time it went on, obviously a lot longer than anticipated. We expected we would have one day of testimony, but there was more than enough questions for him to last well through a second day.
Congressman Adam Schiff there. Let's turn to NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson. Hi, Mara.
Hi there.
A lot to cover here. Let's start with Paul Manafort, Donald Trump, former campaign chairman. Remind us what he has been found guilty of doing and what kind of punishment he could be looking at here.
Well, he could be looking at up to 24 years. He was convicted on bank fraud, tax fraud. All this had to do with his political work for very important people in Ukraine. His attorneys argue that he should get a lighter sentence because he is a first-time offender and because his case had nothing to do with the alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian interference and Russians in the 2016 elections.
Which is important to remind people. I mean, it did come from Manafort's work pre-Trump election days.
Right.
Well, as we mentioned, I mean, that's all happening as Michael Cohen, President Trump's very close former lawyer, fixer, back on the Hill, bringing in a suitcase presumably full of documents. Do we know what he told the Intelligence Committee behind closed doors?
We don't know exactly what he told them. The Democrats on the committee seemed pretty happy with what he said. We know that he said that he was going to bring documents, edited statement that he says were edited by White House lawyers that would prove that the lawyers and the president encouraged him to lie to Congress about how long the negotiations between the Trump organization and Russians took place over how to build Trump Tower Moscow, something that never got built.
Which would be significant if he actually shows that, I mean, he's acknowledged lying himself, but if he tied that lie to people in the White House with documents.
Right, that would be significant. Now, Republicans and the White House have dismissed Cohen. They've said he has no credibility. He lied to Congress once, so he's lying again now.
We should even emphasize Cohen, in addition to his own credibility problems, has not testified that the president explicitly told him, go to Congress and lie. He said that the president suggested that by the way that he spoke, so documents would seem to be essential to back up that claim at all.
Right. He said that's not how the president operates. He operates in code. He says things like, I never negotiated with Russia to build a Trump Tower, did I? Things like that.
So where do Democrats go from here? You say they're feeling happy, but I mean, they came into this year with some risk of looking like they were over-investigating and not paying enough attention to an agenda. I mean, what is their plan?
There's no doubt that's still a risk for them. They want to hear a lot more about Trump Tower in Moscow. They are calling before them a guy named Felix Sater, one of Trump's business associates who's been linked to the Russian mob and has served time in prison. And they've put out a lot of document requests about Russia, the inauguration, Trump's business practices. The White House doesn't want to give them up. The Democrats want to build a case bit by bit against Donald Trump.
All right. NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson for us this morning. Mara, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Democrats who control the House are struggling right now with how to respond to one of their own.
They're debating what to do about Ilhan Omar, the newly elected Minnesota lawmaker, has repeatedly suggested supporters of Israel hold too much power in America, and she's done this in terms that her critics find anti-Semitic. They found that in this recent sentence, which seemed to play on the old notion that American Jews have divided loyalties.
I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country.
Allegiance to a foreign country, that's the phrase that many found bothersome. Some Democrats have criticized Omar, although others, including some of the presidential candidates, say it's fair to critique Israel, and they suggest that Omar is being targeted because she is Muslim.
A lot of this story, of course, playing out in Washington, but how do people who Omar represents view her comments and view this story? Minnesota Public Radio reporter Matt Sepik is with us this morning. Hi there, Matt.
Good morning.
So what are you hearing from the Congresswoman's constituents at home?
Well, David, one opinion we have heard from quite a few people is that the freshman Democrat is being held to a higher standard than many in the GOP, including President Trump. Here's what Patrick Scully had to say. He lives here in Minneapolis and works as a performance artist.
There are Republicans who are making statements that are as objectionable or worse, and resolutions aren't being brought to the floor to condemn them for these statements.
Now, keep in mind that as this controversy swirls, the FBI here in Minneapolis says it's looking into an assassination threat against Ilhan Omar that was scrawled on a bathroom stall at a suburban gas station.
Since she made these comments, I mean, this is recent.
Yes, recently.
Remind us about the district. I mean, there's a pretty sizable Jewish community that she represents, right?
Yes, in the inner ring suburb of St. Louis Park. And one resident we spoke with who's from St. Louis Park says he does want Omar to succeed in Congress, voted for her, but says her rhetoric is frustrating to hear. His name is Matthew Erickson.
As a Jewish constituent of hers, it's been really difficult with her word choice and the language she's used to talk about very important issues, but she continues to use anti-Semitic dog whistles and tropes, and she knows better at this point, and I just don't know where to go.
And remind me, Matt, I mean, this whole debate and conversation is something this district is not unfamiliar with. I mean, wasn't her predecessor, Keith Ellison, also accused of anti-Semitism?
Yes, not in quite the same way, but that issue did come up when Keith Ellison first ran for Congress back in 2006. Critics demanded that he explain his connections back in the 1990s to the Nation of Islam, a group long criticized for being anti-Semitic. And Ellison said back in 2006 that he was drawn to the nation's teachings on black self-sufficiency, but was wrong to dismiss those concerns about anti-Semitism. Ellison went on to serve 6 terms in Congress, won election easily each time, and in November he was elected to statewide office in Minnesota as the state's attorney general.
All right, Matt Sepik, a correspondent with Minnesota Public Radio. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Arizona Republican Senator Martha McSally revealed yesterday that she was raped during her time in the military.
Before entering politics, McSally served more than 2 decades in the U.S. Air Force. She was the first female fighter pilot to fly in combat. During a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing yesterday, she revealed that she was preyed upon and then raped by a superior officer during that time.
I am also a military sexual assault survivor. But unlike so many brave survivors, I didn't report being sexually assaulted. Like so many women and men, I didn't trust the system at the time.
She spoke out at a hearing where some were expressing disgust at failures of the military system to address the problem.
Claudia Grisales covers Congress for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes and joins us this morning. Hi, Claudia.
Hello.
Wow. I mean, this was a senator saying she has personal experience with the topic of this hearing. I mean, did this come as a surprise to people, and how dramatic was it in this hearing room?
It did. It was a very dramatic moment. She sits on the committee. She's a freshman senator. Folks are just getting to know her in the upper chamber. And when she made the admission, it appeared to shock the room. It changed the tone of the hearing and just brought a heavier gravity to the discussion of sexual assault in the military.
What did she say exactly about what she went through?
She said she initially blamed herself, was ashamed, confused, and felt powerless. And she noted that perpetrators abused their positions of power in profound ways. And when she hit the 18-year mark in her career, she considered quitting the military, but later found, as she saw the services grappling with sexual misconduct scandals, that she felt the need to let other people know that she, too, was a survivor. So she identifies as a survivor, and she says it's a personal issue and wants to make change and wants to see commanders who have failed in their responsibility address this major concern for the services.
I want to ask you about some of the sound we heard from her. She said, like so many brave survivors, I didn't report being sexually assaulted. Like so many men and women, I didn't trust the system. Is that still the case in the military? There might be other people who've gone through this who just feel if they come forward, they can't trust the system to serve them.
Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, there are service members out there today who still feel that fear of speaking out because there are remaining concerns. While at the same time, the military has seen recently, by 2018, for example, a record level of sexual assault reports, more than 5,000 who were seeking a law enforcement investigation. Work remains to gain their trust to speak out, as anecdotal reports suggest that retaliation is still a major concern and prosecution levels haven't kept pace.
Do McSally and others feel like the military is making progress in stopping this and addressing it?
They felt that it was incremental, and it's not enough. In 2010, the annual rate of sexual assault of service women was 4.4%, and by 2016, it was 4.3%. So they say there is a very long road ahead.
All right. Claudia Grisales is a reporter covering Congress for the military publication Stars and Stripes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
The man who stood on stage with Donald Trump when he accepted the Republican nomination for president has now been sentenced to almost 4 years in prison.
47 months to be precise, which is far less than what federal sentencing guidelines would suggest for the kinds of financial crimes that Paul Manafort was convicted of. Last year, President Trump's former campaign chairman was found guilty of hiding millions of dollars that he made as a lobbyist for Ukrainian politicians. He was also convicted of lying about his finances in order to get bank loans. The case against Manafort emerged as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian influence in the U.S. election in 2016. Here's Manafort's lawyer, Kevin Downing, speaking after the sentencing.
Most importantly, what you saw today is the same thing that we had said from day one. There is absolutely no evidence that Paul Manafort was involved with any collusion with any government official from Russia.
NPR's Ryan Lucas was at the hearing yesterday and is in our studios this morning. Hey, Ryan.
Good morning.
So the federal guidelines range for sentencing Manafort in this case was 19 to 24 years.
Right.
He got substantially less than that. Why?
Well, it's not unusual for sentencing in white-collar tax cases to fall below the federal guidelines. Judges often decide to impose something below that. In federal court in Alexandria, Virginia yesterday, the presiding judge, T.S. Ellis, called the guidelines range in Manafort's case excessive. He said that it's way out of whack. The sentencing judge takes a bunch of things into account when coming up with a sentence. The guidelines are just one of them. Ellis noted that Manafort was a first-time offender. He lived what he called an otherwise blameless life. He gave him 47 months, so 3 years, 11 months. Also imposed nearly $25 million in restitution. He gave Manafort credit for 9 months he'd already served behind bars. And Ellis defended his decision, saying anyone who scoffs at this sentence should go spend a day in a federal penitentiary.
But Manafort could end up spending even more time because there's another case against him, right? That's still pending, the sentence.
That's right. That case is here in Washington, D.C. It's separate from the one in Virginia, but related in a way. It was also brought by special counsel Robert Mueller. In D.C., Manafort pleaded guilty to 2 conspiracy charges. He also agreed to cooperate with the government. That all blew up, though, earlier this year when the special counsel's team said that he lied to investigators about a number of things. The judge in that case ruled that Manafort did indeed lie about it. 3 things in total. The maximum sentence that Manafort faces in D.C. is 10 years. The big question hanging over this for Judge Amy Berman Jackson in D.C. is whether any sentence that she imposes on Manafort will be served simultaneously to the one in Virginia or staggered. So he could end up getting 10 years on top of what he got in Virginia.
Meanwhile, it's notable he never apologized, right? Like Manafort himself when he appeared here, and those out there have suggested that that could be some kind of effort to get a presidential pardon. Is that in the offing?
Well, there is no talk of a presidential pardon at this time. I spoke with the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, about the question of pardons yesterday. He says there's no discussion, no consideration. Nothing is going to happen as long as the Mueller investigation is going on. But, of course, the president has not himself taken that question off the table.
All right. NPR's Ryan Lucas for us this morning. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Congressional Democrats want to get on the other side of a debate about anti-Semitism that has divided their party.
This started, you'll recall, when Minnesota Democrat Ilhan Omar made comments that were widely seen as anti-Semitic. She spoke, among other things, of supporters of Israel as people with allegiance to a foreign country. Virginia Democrat Elaine Luria is Jewish and served in the Navy.
Am I to look back on my military career and the sacrifices it meant for my family and remain silent in the face of people questioning my loyalty to our country?
Clearly, some Democrats were upset. Omar also had her supporters within her party, and the Democratic-controlled House passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism only after it was broadened to condemn other forms of hate, too.
Okay, so NPR congressional correspondent Susan Davis is in the studio with us this morning to talk about this. Hi, Sue.
Good morning.
So the House took this vote. This began as an effort to censure Ilhan Omar about these anti-Semitic remarks, and then it became something a lot bigger. What happened?
It was on again and off again throughout the week. In the early part of the week, senior party leaders, party chairmen like House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel of New York, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, they wanted to move fast. They were going to put a resolution on the floor that did not name the Minnesota Congresswoman, but did broadly condemn anti-Semitism. And they had to pull back after a private meeting with Democrats on Wednesday, in which a lot of people came to her defense. Younger freshmen like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other freshmen from New York, and members of the Congressional Black Caucus who voiced a lot of reservations about what they were doing. They decided to pull it from the floor and then retracted that decision on Thursday in a hastily decision to put it back on the floor, in part because they were afraid that the House Republicans were going to try to embarrass them on the floor and put something of their own. So in order to get everybody on board, they had to expand what they were condemning to Islamophobia, to white supremacy, and essentially all forms of hatred and bigotry.
Wow. So something that started off specific became, we, the House of Representatives, reject hate.
Correct.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, you can see the awkwardness here because there has been this other debate around the Black Lives Matter movement. And there were some politicians in the Democratic Party who tried to say all lives matter. And it was pointed out that's inappropriate. That's inaccurate. It's something that a lot of Democrats wouldn't get behind. And so you have a somewhat analogous situation here where anti-Semitism matters went to all hate matters.
And Democrats ultimately did vote for it. But I do think it exposed a lot of divisions. It showed that Democrats are divided over whether her comments were even anti-Semitic. They are divided over how aggressive lawmakers can and should criticize Israel and U.S. foreign policy towards Israel. And it also showed how uncomfortable a lot of Democrats were with how quickly Congress moved to rebuke a young African-American woman, one of the first Muslim women in Congress, especially when, I've covered the place a long time. Lots of members say lots of offensive things on lots of different occasions.
Did Democrats also think they were being targeted by cynical criticism from Republicans who have made plenty of remarks of their own?
House Republicans have certainly seized on this. They have called for Ilhan Omar to be taken off of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Democrats have rejected that. Yes, there's a lot of eye rolling on the Democratic side of the aisle when House Republicans are very passionately speaking against anti-Semitism and bigotry because Democrats say, look, President Donald Trump himself has said before his presidency and in his presidency many of things, and Republicans often ignore it, do not respond to it. But when it comes to a young Black Muslim woman, they are the first to get onto the House floor and condemn her.
NPR's congressional correspondent Susan Davis for us this morning. Sue, thank you. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Funerals are being held today for the 23 people killed by a tornado in Alabama last weekend.
The tornado tore a path up to a mile wide as it swept through Lee County and crossed into Georgia. The National Weather Service says this was one of dozens of tornadoes triggered by a storm. Now, the president's going to tour the devastated area today. Alabama Senator Doug Jones already had a look around and spoke at a news conference at a local high school.
You cannot fully appreciate what has happened here without walking through the debris, seeing the photographs, seeing the shoes, seeing the small items that people are trying to recover. The devastation is just absolutely will take your breath away.
Journalist Robert Ray has been on the ground in Alabama reporting for the Washington Post this week and joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Good morning.
Robert, what did you learn about the people who were killed and are being laid to rest in the coming days?
Well, one of the most amazing things that has just come out in the past 24 hours, according to the coroner's office in Lee County, is that a Native American tribe called the Porch Band of Creek Indians has donated, according to coroner's office, $180,000 to cover all the funeral costs for the 23 people killed in Sunday's tornado in Lee County. Really just an unbelievable act of generosity. So those folks there are starting to do the grieving process, and really a terrible scenario. One of the families there lost 10 family members, if you can imagine. So they're going through a lot, and as Doug Jones said in the soundbite you had earlier, you have to really be there to understand the devastation.
Right. What did it look like to you?
Well, I tell you, I saw it from the air and I saw it from the ground, both incredibly devastating and impressive. This is a county of about 140,000 people. It is rural. It's on the border of Georgia and Alabama, and it is a swath that went a half mile wide and 24 miles long, the track of that tornado. So you can imagine all the different homes and the various communities that were ripped up by this. And when you see it in person, it never does it justice. No photograph or no video will ever show exactly the way it really is.
Right. So, as we noted, President Trump is heading there today. And, I imagine the federal government is gonna have to come in and step up and help these people rebuild. What's most urgent right now? I mean, what do these communities need most?
Well, immediately. Well, let me just say this. First of all, the communities are taking care of themselves. I mean, these folks are giving themselves food, water, shelter. They're doing all they can to be all that they can be as people on the ground. As far as what they need from the federal government, yes, they need funds. They need funds to try and rebuild the homes and the businesses that are there. Trump will be there today. We know that his relationship with Governor Kay Ivey is good. She's requested a major disaster declaration, which President Trump has approved for Lee County. And certainly, I think that according to the people that I've talked to on the ground, his presence will be well thought of. We remember back in 2011 during the Tuscaloosa tornado, President Obama showed up then. Yeah. And so, people in Alabama, they want that sort of leadership on the ground.
They'll be receptive. Okay, Robert Ray of the Washington Post. He's been in Alabama reporting. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So David, how was your flight over the weekend?
It was good. I came back from Washington to Los Angeles last night, coast to coast, although, it wasn't lost on me that it was a Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft.
Oh, which would not be lost on you because that's the kind that crashed in Ethiopia over the weekend.
Yeah, and also the kind that crashed recently in Indonesia. I mean, my flight's still operating, but some airlines around the world are now grounding this really popular plane. So is the government of China, where many of the planes are used, and the Ethiopian plane, it crashed 6 minutes after taking off from Addis Ababa airport. All 157 people on board were killed in that plane, though aviation analyst John Nance says it really remains too early to draw conclusions here.
There's nothing right now that I know of that would lend any credence to being concerned about this particular airplane. These two crashes are wildly dissimilar, even though we know very little about what's happened in the second one.
Well, what is the evidence from Ethiopia? NPR's Ada Peralta is in Nairobi and covering this story. Hi there, Ada.
Hi, Steve.
How did this disaster unfold?
So, we're very early into this, so the Ethiopians have only given us a broad outline of what happened. This was a regularly scheduled flight from Addis Ababa to Nairobi, and we know that shortly after takeoff, the pilot called the control tower and asked them if he could return to the airport because he was having technical difficulties. Flight tracking data from the website Flight Radar 24 tells us that the plane was seesawing. The plane gained altitude but then dropped, and it gained altitude again and then dropped, and 6 minutes after takeoff, the plane lost contact and crashed. Ethiopian Airlines says that the pilot was a veteran with an outstanding records. They say that the plane, as you mentioned, the Boeing 737 MAX 8, was brand new, and they say they had gotten no indications that anything was wrong with it. Ethiopia has started an investigation, and the National Transportation Safety Board says it is sending a team to help them.
Well, Ada, we've already heard that note of caution. We don't know that this is the same as the Lion Air flight, and in fact, John Nance indicated some differences, but some airlines are clearly taking precautions. So what is the evidence so far?
I mean, there's a huge question, right? Why two brand new Boeing planes have crashed within months of each other. At the time of the Indonesia crash, pilots were up in arms. They were angry that they were angry at Boeing for making changes to the flight control systems without telling them. And this morning, Ethiopian grounded its 737 MAX fleet. They said it was out of caution, and China ordered all of the airlines to do the same. Aviation experts are now looking at the U.S., what the FAA and what the NTSB will do. Southwest Airlines and American Airlines are flying dozens of these planes, and this is Boeing's best-selling plane. They still have 5,000 of them on order.
Wow.
So whatever happens here, it will have a big impact on one of the biggest players in aviation.
Okay, same type of plane. In each case, crashed shortly after takeoff, but of course plane crashes tend to be so complicated there could be many differences. We don't know. Who, in brief, was on board this plane, Ada?
So it was people from 35 different countries. The United Nations says that they believe at least 19 of their staff members were on there. You had students, you had academics, diplomats, and now the families are picking up the pieces.
Story just beginning. Ada, thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
That's NPR's Ada Peralta. All right, the White House releases its annual budget proposal this morning, and there's a big ask in there.
Yeah, President Trump now wants more than $8 billion to build a wall on the border with Mexico. This is the president's top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, speaking on Fox News Sunday.
I would just say that the whole issue of the wall and border security is of paramount importance. We have a crisis down there. I think the president has made that case very effectively.
And so this sets up another potential spending fight between President Trump and Congress after the recent partial government shutdown.
NPR's Mara Eliason covered that shutdown and is covering, well, whatever's going to happen next, and she's on the line. Good morning, Mara.
Hi, Steve.
I guess just the basics here. Is this budget proposal likely to be anything like what Congress enacts into law?
No. These budget proposals are always political documents. They lay out the president's vision and his priorities. In this case, increases in defense spending and cuts in foreign aid, domestic programs, environmental protection, new strict rules for anti-poverty programs. And the cliche, of course, is they're dead on arrival when they come to Capitol Hill. Even when the president's party controls Congress, the budgets rarely get reenacted as written. And this time it will be even more so because the Democrats' priorities are very, very different.
I guess this is the equivalent of if you have a job, you ask for a raise. It doesn't mean you're going to get it. So they're asking for a raise in the wall, so to speak. Why reopen the issue when the last round of wall funding battles with Congress went so badly for the president?
Well, I think you heard Larry Kudlow. This is extremely important to the president. In that funding deal, he didn't get wall money. He just got $1.3 billion for 55 miles of barriers. And ironically, this request arrives on Capitol Hill the same week that the Senate will vote on the president's emergency declaration to allow him to build the wall with funds that Congress did not appropriate. Looks like there'll be enough Republicans to join Democrats to defeat that, although they don't have enough votes to override his veto. But it's a signature issue for him. It's important to his base. And because it's become his number one priority and almost a symbol of his presidency, Democrats have made stopping it the symbol of their opposition to him.
Well, how concerned is the administration about a bigger picture question, the deficit?
Not very much, although there are some across-the-board cuts in this budget, 5% for domestic programs. But remember, the president ran during the campaign on not just getting rid of the deficit, but getting rid of the entire national debt. But now neither side cares very much about the deficit. The president put these 5% cuts into his budget to show that he is doing something about spending. But Democrats and Republicans both don't care much anymore about the deficit.
I guess when you say it's a political document, that's a part that certainly is. You can put in a wish list of massive cuts to government spending in full confidence that neither Democrats nor Republicans in Congress really want that, and they're not likely to do that.
That's right.
Mara, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Mara Liasson. Some other news now. How are U.S.-backed forces fighting to take the last scrap of territory away from ISIS?
Yeah, you say scrap, Steve. I mean, this really is just a patch of land that's a few hundred yards wide. The Syrian Defense Forces suspended their attacks on this land to let civilians leave. Now they have resumed these attacks. National Security Advisor John Bolton notes that taking this territory, though, does not end the threat.
We know right now that there are ISIS fighters scattered still around Syria and Iraq, and that ISIS itself is growing in other parts of the world. The ISIS threat will remain, but one reason that the president has committed to keeping an American presence in Iraq and a small part of an observer force in Syria is against the possibility that there would be a real resurgence of ISIS.
NPR's Ruth Sherlock is on the line and covering this story. Hi, Ruth.
Hello.
How's the fighting going?
Well, it's intense as of last night. Videos from the area show these flashes of artillery pounding this small area, as you said. You can kind of look out across it from the front line. You can see, if you look through binoculars, there's a black flag for ISIS raised on what's left of one of the few buildings. But the SDF, that's the US-backed forces fighting ISIS, say that there's this complex network of tunnels and caves where ISIS fighters and their families are hiding out.
Well, now, we mentioned that this offensive was delayed, deliberately so that civilians could be allowed to flee the area before this bombardment began. I suppose they now feel that the civilians have all left, have they?
Well, we don't believe so entirely. It's very hard to say exactly how many people are still inside, but one major concern is that there are families of ISIS fighters and also hostages. In particular, we've been following the case of this man, Bashir al-Shikhdar. He's an American father who lives in Florida, and about 4 years ago, his wife kidnapped their 2 children. One of them was just an infant, less than a year old, and brought them to Syria to join ISIS. But his wife was recently killed, so now he has these 2 children, and actually they now have a half-sister, in Syria somewhere, and he's desperately looking for them. We went to Iraq with him, where he went to lobby US officials, tried to go across the border into Syria, and he knew nothing about them. Well, we've now been told by multiple sources, though this isn't confirmed, that these children are still inside this area, Baghouz. It's every parent's nightmare. He feels like he finally knows where they are, but he's also being told that the family who's holding them doesn't want to get out, doesn't want to let them go. So he's now watching this offensive in just utter terror, believing that his children are under the bombs.
And a brutal situation that reminds us that in these kinds of civil conflicts and conflicts involving extremist groups, it's hard to draw a distinction between who's a civilian and who's a fighter, particularly if you have someone like this family you described, that they arguably are civilians, except they want to stay, they want to fight, which means the children will stay and fight.
Right, and a lot of people are also terrified of leaving, and it's hard to say how. They just don't know what will happen next. It's hard to say how long this situation is going to continue for. Some officials, the Kurdish, the US-backed people say, this could take just a few days. Others say it could take a couple of weeks to get into this area, and in the meantime, these people are being heavily bombarded. It really is also a lesson that you can't bomb an ideology into oblivion. Even some of the people that have left this area say they continue to support ISIS. Some of the women that have spoken to reporters in the area say they remain defiant and are going to raise their children in the belief of the group. So just because this offensive is ongoing doesn't mean that, ISIS as a group is over.
Ruth, thanks for your reporting.
Thank you very much.
That's NPR's Ruth Sherlock. How are different countries making such different decisions about the Boeing 737 MAX 8?
Yeah, people in Australia will not be boarding those planes for a while, nor will people in China or Singapore or Indonesia. All of those countries and some airlines in other countries grounded the popular planes after 2 of them crashed in recent months. Federal regulators are not taking any such action here in the United States, though. The Federal Aviation Administration is calling the planes safe and airworthy. This is Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao.
I want people to be assured that we take these accidents very seriously. We are reviewing them very carefully.
NPR's David Shaper covers the aviation industry for us. David, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
I guess we should note people consider the FAA almost the gold standard for aviation safety. Safety is a big deal here in the United States, but why would the FAA say this plane is fine?
And we should say that air travel is just incredibly safe. It's the safest mode of transportation we have. But the FAA issued a notification late yesterday saying that it essentially just considers the 737 MAX 8 to be safe and airworthy because it just has no other evidence to suggest that otherwise. They're downplaying reports that draw similarities between this accident in Ethiopia on Sunday and the Lion Air flight crash in Indonesia last October. Saying that the crashes, there's no evidence linking the two together. That crash in Indonesia happened shortly after takeoff, as did the one in Ethiopia over the weekend. And it appears that both pilots were struggling to keep the plane from nosediving down. And in that Lion Air crash, investigators focused on a new automated flight control system that didn't exist on previous versions of the planes. And many pilots complained that they didn't know about and hadn't been trained on. But again, the FAA says there's no evidence that requires them to ground the fleet here in the U.S. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao does say, however, that officials could change that posture if there are investigators on the site looking into this Ethiopian crash.
If the FAA identifies an issue that affects safety, the department will take immediate and appropriate action.
I'm trying to follow the logic here, David. I guess if there was no similarity between these two crashes, each is a 1 in a million kind of event, you don't generally need to worry about the plane. But if it was the same thing happening twice, then you'd have a problem. You'd have to worry about other planes. How are passengers responding to the idea that the plane seems fine?
Well, many travelers are uneasy just because we don't know anything about what caused the second crash yet, and if it is related. There are about a couple dozen of these planes flying in the U.S. right now. Southwest has 34 of them. They have the most. American Airlines has 24, and United has 14 of a slightly different version, the MAX 9 jet. And there are members of Congress who are calling on these planes to be grounded immediately, same with airline passenger organizations. Paul Hudson is with flyersrights.org, and he says it's really unprecedented to have 2 new planes just months off the assembly line crash like this. And he says the FAA is taking a big risk by not ordering the plane to be grounded.
I think the path is clear. We either ground them until we can have proper safety assurances, or we sit back and wait potentially for the next crash.
It would be hard for people not to notice that the agency that is supporting this plane at the moment is in the same country as the company that makes it, Boeing.
and Boeing has a lot on the line. They've sold 5,000 models of this plane that they're on order, and it's the best-selling Boeing plane ever. The stock price dropped 5% on Monday at the end of the day. That's billions in value for this company, and they've had other problems going back to another new plane, the 787 Dreamliner, just a few years ago.
David, thanks for the update.
My pleasure, Steve.
That's NPR's David Schaper. Wow, the Brexit deadline is less than 3 weeks away.
Yeah, British Prime Minister Theresa May says she has secured now some new concessions from the European Union. She just returned from meetings in France last night ahead of a crucial vote on Brexit in Parliament today. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker says the EU will no longer budge.
In politics, sometimes you get a second chance. It is what we do with the second chance that counts, because there will be no third chance.
NPR's Frank Langfitt is in London covering the second chance. Hi there, Frank.
Hey, good morning, Steve.
How, if at all, is this deal improved from the British point of view compared to the deals that Britain's Parliament has not liked in the past?
Well, and I think it's a matter of perspective. Certainly the Prime Minister last night was saying that there's new language. Basically, what she's saying is there are these legally binding changes from Brussels that would prevent the United Kingdom being trapped permanently into an EU customs arrangement. This gets quite legalistic, but basically she and others are saying this language gives more weight to guarantees that this customs arrangement would only be temporary. The United Kingdom is very worried about that, afraid they'll kind of never really be able to leave the European Union. But earlier this morning, what we've seen, Labour opposition leaders have been picking apart the language, saying it really doesn't change that much. Jean-Claude Juncker, you just heard from there, actually told the BBC that this complements the earlier deal, but not really a change. And so that's going to be a big point of debate today in the House of Commons. Does this really change anything? And I think you're going to hear different opinions.
Well, let's remember that the last time Parliament had a vote on this Brexit deal that was somewhat different, it was overwhelmingly defeated, not even close to close.
It is. And I would say that before last night, the likelihood of this passing was extremely remote. And it looked like the Prime Minister was probably looking at a big, big defeat. I think this will narrow it. The question is how much, and can she win over Brexiteers who have basically said, if we get trapped inside the European Union customs arrangement, this violates our sovereignty. We can't cut new free trade deals with other countries. And so she really has to get enough of actually people in her own party to support her tonight to get this across the goal line. The other thing is she'd really have to flip over 100 votes from the last time back in January. That's a tall order. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, the debate today at the House of Commons.
Well, let's look ahead the way you have to in a chess game, looking several moves ahead. Let's say that this measure goes before Parliament. She doesn't get that 100 votes flipped. Theresa May loses. Her government loses. What happens then?
Well, then the next day, this will be on Wednesday, there's going to be a vote should the United Kingdom walk away from the European Union with no deal at all. That is not expected to pass because there's really been hardly any preparations for that. It would be a significant economic cost. Businesses here are already furious, Steve, with the government allowing all of this huge change to go down to the wire. And it could really affect them, could cause a lot of disruption on the border. So we don't think that will pass either.
And so then Britain would do what if they're saying, we have no deal we like, we don't want to leave with no deal? What do they do then?
Well, the last option, this could come up Wednesday or Thursday, assuming that these votes go the way some people expect, a vote to delay. And this is, of course, after 2 years of negotiations. Basically, the UK would say we want to delay. The European Union, 27 countries would have to agree. Jean-Claude Juncker already said, if we do a delay, it's not going to be for many months. It would probably be at the latest, maybe late May, end of June, because they're European parliamentary elections, and it doesn't make sense to have United Kingdom members in the European Parliament when the UK's actually left the European Union.
Wow. Well, we'll continue to follow these developments through the reporting of NPR's Frank Langfitt. Frank, thanks so much.
Happy to do it, Steve.
Here in the United States, how many more Democrats will seek their party's presidential nomination?
Well, it's a good question. More than a dozen have already declared, and some big names have not made official announcements yet. They include former Vice President Joe Biden, also former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Stacey Abrams, the former candidate for Georgia governor, also says a run is on the table.
NPR's Tamara Keith is with us. Tamara, are you running?
No.
Okay.
I am one of the only people not running.
Oh,
it
that's
seems.
right, exactly.
But
And you
also, I'm
co-host,
not
not a Democrat, you co-host our politics podcast, as long as we're clear on that. Let's talk about the political context in which these decisions are being made. You have a vulnerable president. He's under a lot of pressure. He's under a lot of investigation by the Democratic House. Although Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, is now saying that she's not ruling out an effort to impeach President Trump, but she takes a dim view of it or sets a high bar. Let's listen.
They wanted me to impeach President Bush for the Iraq War. I didn't believe in it then. I don't believe in it now. It divides the country unless there's some conclusive evidence that takes us to that place.
That's Nancy Pelosi speaking to the Washington Post. Why would she be reluctant?
Well, I think what she's saying is that there should be a high bar, and it's what she's been saying all along, though this has generated quite some buzz in the last 24 hours or so. The investigations are ongoing, and what she's saying is, this sort of thing should not be taken lightly. And there has been certainly some pushback from people on the left side of the party who want President Trump out now. But Pelosi is also making a political calculation here that impeachment without the Senate coming along to convict would potentially be a political problem for Democrats.
So let's talk about the Democrats who would rather try to be the one to remove the president through conventional electoral politics. Joe Biden is talking today. Is that right?
That's right. He is speaking to the International Association of Firefighters Union. He's not expected to announce that he's running, but he is expected to test out his messaging. His allies say that, well, they've been saying he was 95% of the way to the running. Now they say it's higher than 95%. But again, we're not expecting an announcement today.
I'm just thinking if the number's higher than 95, there's 96, there's 97,
Not
there's
a lot of
99.
numbers.
Who knows? Anyway, so Biden decides who else is out there?
So Beto O'Rourke, he is the former Texas congressman who lost in the Senate race to Ted Cruz, but has excited a lot of Democrats along the way. He is headed to Iowa this weekend to campaign for a state Senate candidate, which is something several other 2020 candidates are doing. Then a bunch of other names floating out there. Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, Congressman Seth Moulton, Eric Swalwell, Montana Governor Steve Bullock. There are still a lot of names.
Okay, and I guess whoever gets the Democratic nomination is assured of campaigning in Wisconsin this time around, since that's where the convention will be.
And Hillary Clinton didn't campaign there in the general election, and there are lots of regrets about that.
Milwaukee is the city. Tamara, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Tamara Keith.
If you're a wealthy family, you certainly enjoy some advantages when you're sending your kids to college.
Potentially phenomenal advantages that are considered within the rules. People donate big money to schools or lean on their famous names or claim legacy slots at the elite schools they attended. Yet federal prosecutors say that for dozens of parents, these advantages were not enough. Working through a consultant, they allegedly paid for fake test results. They allegedly bought bogus athletic scholarships and other fraudulent advantages for their kids. FBI Special Agent Joe Bonavolonta helped to identify the parents through an investigation codenamed Varsity Blues.
This is a case where they flaunted their wealth, sparing no expense, to cheat the system so they could set their children up for success with the best education money could buy, literally.
And for more, we're joined by Alyssa Nadworny from NPR's education team, who's been covering this. Hi, Alyssa.
Hey, David.
What exactly happened here?
So this is really a story about a bunch of wealthy parents trying to scam their way into elite universities. So according to the Justice Department, 33 parents paid, quote, enormous sums of money. So we're talking $500,000 in some cases to a man named William Rick Singer in exchange for fabricating academic and athletic credentials and to arrange bribes. Here's Andrew Lelling, the U.S. Attorney, the District of Massachusetts, announcing the charges on Tuesday.
We're talking about deception and fraud, fake test scores, fake athletic credentials, fake photographs, bribed college officials.
Wow. Okay, so you're buying fake credentials, fake pictures of students, fake test scores. How were these things actually used to make a difference and get slots in these schools?
Yeah, so there's two main ways that they went about doing this. The first is through falsifying tests such as the SAT and the ACT. According to the Justice Department, Singer would have parents request an accommodation, so to give students more time on their tests. It's often used for students with disabilities. During that extended time, a proctor would provide answers, or in some cases, after a student took the test, answers would be altered for an improved score.
They would change the answers to make sure the scores were higher?
Yep, and in some cases, another person altogether would actually sit for the exam.
Wow.
The other way that they did this was through college athletics. So coaches were in on it. So they're taking bribes to pretend to recruit students to sports like lacrosse, sailing, tennis. Many of the students didn't even play these sports competitively. So in some cases, coaches made fake athletic records, and parents would have to pay for their kid's face to basically be photoshopped to look like they were playing the sport in question.
It would look like they were like some lacrosse star in high school, even though they had no idea how to play lacrosse.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is happening at the universities that are involved here? What are they saying?
So the schools themselves have not been charged. So students from schools that are involved say they're the victims here. So they're cooperating with the investigation. We've seen prominent coaches get put on leave or be fired. According to prosecutors, the majority of the students involved, they're still enrolled, so they have yet to graduate. And it's unclear what's going to happen to them. In many of these cases, court records show that students were actually kept in the dark from their parents.
The parents were just doing this on their own. This is just amazing. I mean, you cover education. Does this tell us something we might not have realized about, elite college admissions?
Well, so there's lots of ways that privilege and wealth permeate elite college admissions. Like, we've known that. You mentioned, people donate money for buildings to curry favor in admissions.
Sure.
There's also legacy, which gives preferential treatment to students of alumni. So, I think this case highlights some weak spots in the admissions cycle, so college sports and these entrance exams. It's also important to remember these are highly selective schools, so just a small portion of students get in. And I think that's what makes this story so upsetting. Like, we know how hard it is to get in. Like, we want to believe that if we work hard, we'll be able to get there.
It's also a reminder there's a huge debate about income inequality in this country. So often experts and well-meaning people will say education is the answer to inequality, and what we have here is a symptom of how even that benefit is reserved for the very few in many cases.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this case has the potential to expose a lot. NPR's Alyssa Nabwani. Thanks so much, Alyssa.
Thanks.
So California's governor says the many people on death row in this state are going to remain there.
He will not allow them to be sent for execution. An order expected from Governor Gavin Newsom will put an executive moratorium on the death penalty in the state. Newsom is a longtime critic of the death penalty system, which he calls a failure.
And let's talk to Scott Schaefer, who reports from member station KQED in San Francisco. Good morning, Scott.
Hey, good morning.
All right, so walk us through exactly what the governor is doing here.
Yeah, so it really is several things. The most important is that this order he's going to sign places a moratorium on executions in California, basically by giving a reprieve to the men and women, mostly men, who are on death row, so suspending the executions for a while. The second thing it does is closes the state's execution chamber at San Quentin Prison, and that's almost a formality since it really hasn't been used at all since 2006. That was the last time California put somebody to death. And finally, it withdraws the state's lethal injection protocol. It's been under review for several years now. That's why there haven't been any executions. And that's important because there are some 25 inmates on death row right now who've exhausted their legal appeals. So if executions were to begin, we would have sort of a season of executions in California.
So one big central question here is whether the governor can do this at a moment when it seems like California voters are against him on this issue. I mean, voters in the state twice rejected measures to repeal the death penalty. And Newsom actually talked about this in 2016. He was talking to the Modesto Bee when a repeal was on the ballot. Let's listen.
My position has always been, if ever I was in a position to actually be accountable, I would be accountable to the will of the voters. And I would not get my personal opinions in the way of the public's right to make a determination if they want to take us as it relates to the death penalty.
So now he's governor. Is he doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do?
Not really. The governor in California has the power to issue reprieves, and he can do that. That's what he's doing. Now, if you support the death penalty, you're going to be very angry because, in 2016, voters passed another ballot measure to speed up executions. Narrowly passed it, 51-49. So if you're one of those folks who voted for that, you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, I voted for this already, and you're screwing it up. So, but technically, he isn't eliminating the death penalty. He's just suspending it.
Okay, technically he's just suspending it, and he has the power to do it. But given what voters have said, I mean, politically, this could be quite a challenge for him as this goes forward. Well, let me ask you this: as this goes forward, I mean, there's 737 people on death row in the state. I think more than in any state in the country. What happens to them now?
Well, kind of the same thing that's been happening for the past 13 years, David. The population is getting older. There's a saying or a joke, really, that the leading cause of death on death row in California is old age, and that's pretty much true. The governor's order doesn't change anyone's conviction or their sentence. No one's getting out of prison. There'll be no executions as long as Newsom is governor, but, that could change if a new governor comes in or if there's a lawsuit that somehow forces California to change the policy and get rid of those reprieves.
All right, Scott Schaefer reports from member station KQED in San Francisco, giving us that news about the governor's moves today. Scott, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
So how much prison time is enough for the most senior Catholic cleric ever charged with sexual abuse?
An Australian judge gave his answer, sentencing Cardinal George Pell to 6 years for the sexual abuse of 2 boys in 1996. Judge Peter Kidd acknowledged the possibility that Pell may not live to be released from prison. He's 77 years old now. This is still not a satisfying moment for one of the victims, who issued a statement read here by lawyer Vivian Waller.
It is hard for me, for the time being, to take comfort in this outcome. I appreciate that the court has acknowledged what was inflicted upon me as a child. However, there is no rest for me.
Let's turn to NPR's Sylvia Poggioli, who covers the Vatican and has been following this whole issue for some time now. She joins us from Rome. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi there.
So take us back a little bit, if you can, and remind us the history in the case of Cardinal Pell.
Well, 2 weeks ago, when a gag order was lifted, we learned that in December, Pell had been found guilty on 5 charges of sexually abusing 2 minors in Melbourne's cathedral, where he was archbishop, and he was immediately taken to jail. Today, Judge Peter Kidd set a non-parole period of 3 years and 8 months. He described Pell's conduct as staggering arrogance and said he had not shown remorse. Now, Pell faced a maximum 10 years for each charge, and the light sentence, disappointed a lot of the lawyers of the victims. But the judge said Pell had an otherwise blameless life, and that given his age, he doesn't pose a risk of reoffending. Nevertheless, he had to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life.
And this goes back, to accusations from years ago, right?
Absolutely. And there are other cases now. There's another of the victims who died. His family now is considering a civil suit against Pell.
So he is maintaining his innocence and has even filed an appeal here. So this might not be the end of this case.
Absolutely. And now he's had nothing publicly. But, this is really a huge blow to that. This is the downfall of a prominent Vatican figure. He's the most senior Catholic official found guilty in a secular court for sex abuse of minors. In 2014, Pope Francis made him head of a new ministry, Economic Affairs, with the task of putting the Vatican's finances in order. But, then he had to take a leave of absence 3 years ago and return to Australia to face trial.
So this has been a moment, Sylvia, when the Vatican has been grappling with this issue, not enough as many people would like. So how do they respond to the case of someone so senior being actually, sent to prison?
Well, 2 weeks ago, the Vatican said only it will wait for an appeal. But it also announced its doctrinal office will investigate on its own that Pell is no longer head of the economic ministry. This is just one of several big blows for the Vatican. Last week, French Cardinal Philippe Barbarin offered to resign after he was given a 6-month suspended sentence for failing to report allegations of abuse of minors by a priest. Meanwhile, prosecutors in Costa Rica are raiding the offices of a church tribunal as part of a probe. And in the U.S., several attorney generals are investigating local churches. I think we see this is the end of a centuries-old practice of those silent agreements in which governments had a hands-off, non-interference policy towards the Catholic Church. The officials can no longer expect they're going to have to be held accountable by civil justice systems.
NPR's Sylvia Poggioli on NPR News.
The Federal Aviation Administration now faces an awkward question.
The FAA announced it is grounding all models of the Boeing 737 MAX 8. It was responding to worldwide concern after 2 recent crashes. But here is that question. If there are concerns about the plane, why did the agency insist for days that the plane was safe? FAA Acting Administrator Daniel Elwell says there is a reason. The agency acted after learning new information about the Ethiopian Airlines flight that crashed this week.
We're resolute
in our position that we would not take action until we had data to support taking action. That data coalesced today.
NPR's David Shaper covers aviation and is with us once again this morning. David, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
What was the new data that they gathered?
Well, there was evidence collected at the ground at the site of the impact of the crash, and there's also newly enhanced satellite imagery of the Ethiopian Airlines flight track in the sky, as well as an analysis of the aircraft's configuration just after it took off. And that's what really drove this decision to ground the planes in the U.S. from the FAA's perspective. Here again is FAA Administrator Dan Elwell talking on a conference call with reporters.
Both new pieces of information were added fidelity, missing pieces that we did not have prior to today, that aligned the track from Ethiopian Airlines track to Lion Air, closer than anything we had up until today.
You know, the acting administrator is saying here that there's now evidence that the crashes of the Ethiopian Airlines flight on Sunday and the Lion Air flight in Indonesia in October were similar. But what's interesting is that many other countries didn't need that evidence and acted days ago out of what they said was an abundance of caution, which kind of begs the question, why didn't the U.S. act a little sooner in a more precautionary way? And part of the reason may be that there was just so much public pressure that was building on the FAA and the Trump administration to do this because of this second crash of a new plane, a new Boeing 737 MAX 8 plane in less than 5 months. And that alone is extremely unusual.
And of course, we heard from aviation officials, former aviation officials on this program in the last few days. The FAA was very focused on wanting to act only when they had data, and abundance of caution was not enough for them. Now they are acting, though. How's the traveling public affected?
Well, you know, a lot of people, there will be, several hundred, maybe a few thousand people affected, but the overall impact should be somewhat minimal. There's about 70 of these planes that were flying in the U.S. They took about 225 flights a day. The airlines that use these planes are Southwest and American. They had the 737 MAX 8, and United flew a longer version of the 737 MAX 9. And those airlines, to a great extent, will just be able to swap out those planes and rotate other aircraft in to fill those routes. A few flights may be canceled here and there in some cases, and in those cases the airlines will just rebook passengers without change fees, and if scheduling doesn't work out on a rebooked flight, they are offering some refunds.
Let me circle back now to the investigation, David Shaper, because this is effectively an acknowledgement that something is going on with the 737 MAX 8 that has not been solved. How do investigators go about figuring out what that is?
One of the key pieces of evidence, or two pieces of evidence, are the so-called black boxes, which are actually orange, as we've reported before. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. Those are now in France, in Paris, to be analyzed by the Transportation Accident Agency there. That'll tell investigators an awful lot about what the plane was doing, what alerts were going off, what actions the crew was trying to take. And both those devices were pretty badly damaged in the crash, so it may take some time for them to extract that data and really find out what was happening with the plane. And there could be quite a few different causes, as there often are.
David, thanks for the update.
My pleasure, Steve.
NPR's David Shaper. For the first time, we have a bit of evidence suggesting that the special counsel's Russia investigation may be done.
Yeah, NPR has learned that a key prosecutor, Andrew Weissman, is leaving the office. He helped build the case against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. Manafort, we should say, was sentenced a second time yesterday to serve a total sentence of about 7.5 years in prison.
Well, what does that prosecutor's departure tell us? Let's ask NPR National Justice Correspondent Carrie Johnson, who learned of it. Carrie, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
Well, what does this personnel move in effect mean?
It's the strongest sign yet the special counsel is done investigating. Andrew Weissman, one of the most prominent members of the team, is leaving the special counsel unit. Two sources tell me he's going to teach and do some scholarship at New York University, and they say he wouldn't be leaving unless the Russia investigation was complete. I'm hearing to expect more signs of wrapping up in the next 2 weeks maximum. Remember, Steve, the lead FBI agent assigned to the Mueller probe started a new job in Richmond, Virginia this month. Other lawyers have been moving on too. But Weissman was the most well-known. He's been attacked by conservative talk show hosts and called a killer by Steve Bannon, one of President Trump's former advisors.
And now he's moving on, and you indicate that doesn't mean we're going to hear the end of the investigation tomorrow, but maybe in the next couple of weeks, and we will see. All this comes after Manafort's sentencing, second sentencing, I guess we should say. How'd that go down?
The judge in Washington has sentenced Paul Manafort to serve almost 4 years in prison. Add that to the punishment Manafort received in Virginia last week. That means he'll spend about 7.5 years behind bars total. The D.C. judge Amy Jackson was not buying Paul Manafort's remorse yesterday. She said he used other people's money to support his own extravagant lifestyle. Too many houses for one family to enjoy. Too many suits for one man to wear, she said. She also said that Paul Manafort had spent his whole life spinning. He treated the legal process the same way. Problem is, Judge Jackson said, courts are one of the places where facts still matter. And she said, saying I'm sorry I got caught is not an effective plea for leniency.
Yeah, but help me out here, Carrie. In spite of criticizing Manafort in all the ways you just described, didn't this judge, like the judge in the other sentencing, give Manafort a shorter sentence than might have been possible under the law?
In the D.C. case, the total maximum sentence was 10 years. The judge was bound to take into account part of the sentence the Virginia judge had given based on complicated legal rules and sentencing guidelines. So she did give him a lot of extra time, she said, because Manafort had committed a new crime while he was already indicted in D.C., that he had allegedly attempted to tamper with witnesses in his case while the case was ongoing.
So you're telling me that when you work through the various factors the judge had to consider, this actually is a fairly strict sentence.
Former prosecutors who had been kind of outraged about the relatively light sentence in Virginia last week seemed to have come down to the idea that 7.5 years total is a more normal sentence for somebody like Paul Manafort, who of course had never been convicted of a crime before this one.
Okay, and now we should just note before we go that New York prosecutors have issued their own indictment against Paul Manafort.
Yes, state charges which would remain even if President Trump does decide to pardon Paul Manafort on the federal offenses. There is a big question about whether double jeopardy applies here, whether Manafort is being charged with the same offenses in the federal and the state system. That's going to be key to any defense he mounts in New York State.
Carrie, thanks.
My pleasure.
NPR's Carrie Johnson, and we'll note again, Carrie is reporting that a key prosecutor is leaving the Mueller investigation, which is seen as a sign that the Russia investigation may be done. Now let's turn to a religious minority that suffered under the Islamic State in Syria and elsewhere.
Yeah, we're talking about the Yazidis, a religious minority that ISIS tried to exterminate. With ISIS in Syria nearly expunged, some of those captured but now freed Yazidis are making their way home to Iraq.
NPR's Jane Araf has been covering the story of the Yazidis for years. She met some of those people who've been freed and is on the line from Cairo. Hi there, Jane.
Hi, Steve.
Who'd you meet?
Well, I met women who had been bought and sold repeatedly, their husbands executed, separated from their children. I talked to relatives of girls who had been sold when they were 10 years old. So ISIS considered this ancient minority infidels, and that made it permissible to them to kill them and buy and sell them as sex slaves. And then there were the boys in the camp for displaced Yazidis in Iraq. I met Mazen, who was 13. He had actually even forgotten the language that Yazidis speak, and we spoke in Arabic, the language of his captors.
Because he'd been in custody for several years. 13-year-old couldn't speak his native language anymore.
5 years. Some of them have forgotten his name. And it was, for Mazen and others, it was really hard. There wasn't enough to eat. They were moved from place to place as the caliphate shrunk. He saw other children killed in airstrikes. And Steve, he was in a training camp with other Yazidi children. He talked a bit about what ISIS taught him.
كلاشينكوف وبكيسي سلاحات الخفيفة نجي ننفذ بيكم.
So there he's telling me that they taught him how to shoot a Kalashnikov, Russian assault rifles, and other what he called light weapons. He was being trained to kill Yazidis, his own people.
Really disturbing to hear that word Kalashnikov spoken by such a young sounding voice. What else have you learned about the Yazidis, Jane?
So if we recall back to 2014 when the Yazidis fled the massacre, now acknowledged as a genocide in Sinjar in northern Iraq, the U.S. actually came into the war against ISIS, in part to help save the Yazidis. So it's 5 years later, and there are still more than 2,500 of them missing. Now, everyone who comes back, like Mazen, raises the hope among the families that more will be found, but a lot of them won't be. They've been killed in airstrikes in Mosul and Raqqa. They've been sold onward to other groups. There's a human trafficking ring for children in Turkey. And Yazidis, understandably, are distraught. They're holding protests and they're calling on the U.S. and others to help. The UN this week is starting to exhume mass graves because thousands of them were killed as well.
Is there any reason, Jane, to think that some of those 2,500 people might be alive somewhere in the world?
So I talked to one of the Yazidi smugglers, and the way a lot of these people have been brought back is they've been purchased or they've been smuggled out. Now lately with Baghouz in Syria falling, they're trickling out, but there isn't much hope for more than a few hundred of them because a lot of them killed and some don't know who they are anymore. A lot of them were taken as children. It's a tragedy to this very small community.
Shouldn't be surprised or shocked, and yet I am. 2019, we're talking about human beings bought and sold. NPR's Jane Araf, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We are going to begin with the tragic news from New Zealand.
Yeah, 2 mass shootings in the city of Christchurch have left at least 49 people dead, many others injured. At least one gunman targeted 2 different mosques. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, called it a terrorist attack.
These are people who I would describe as having extremist views that have absolutely no place in New Zealand and, in fact, have no place in the world.
Police said that 4 people, including 3 men, 1 woman, had been taken into custody. One of those suspects has been charged with murder.
And let's talk to one of the reporters who's been covering this. It's Keith Lynch. He's deputy editor of the New Zealand news site Stuff, and joins me now. Thanks for being here.
No problem.
This is just terrible news. The death toll is rising. I know there are just scores more people in hospitals and injured. Just give us the latest in what you're hearing.
Yeah, so at this stage, we know that at least 49 people have been killed in what is certainly a well-planned attack. The Prime Minister and the Police Commissioner, as you noted, have called it a terrorist attack. This is absolutely unprecedented in New Zealand. There are dozens more people in hospital at the moment. At least 1 person has died tonight in Christchurch Hospital after being taken there after this gunman opened fire across these 2 mosques. We know that about 40 people were killed at one mosque in Dean's Avenue in Christchurch, and about 7 to 8 others were killed in the Linwood Mosque. So that would be about a 15-minute drive from one of those mosques to the others. As you guys have noted, there's been 4 arrests in the city, including 1 woman, and 1 man has been charged with murder. He'll appear in Christchurch District Court tomorrow morning.
Is anyone talking about a motive at this point?
Yeah, so the man who was being arrested, he's a 28-year-old Australian man who came to Christchurch with a specific idea to carry out these attacks. So he has published a manifesto online. We made the decision today not to repeat what is in his manifesto because we don't think it's right to give oxygen to his ideology. What it does contain, I can say broadly speaking, is extreme hatred and extreme racism, particularly towards Muslims.
You said this is unprecedented in your country. Can you talk about that and talk about how people are coping with this?
Yeah, so New Zealand is, it's a pretty quiet country. Christchurch is a really quiet and peaceful city. We had an absolutely horrific disaster here back in 2011 when 185 people were killed in a major earthquake. This is much different because that was a natural disaster. This is a man-made disaster. Christchurch is in a real sense of shock tonight. Everything is closed. The entire city was in lockdown. Every school in the city was in lockdown today. People, I think, are really still coming to terms with what has happened.
Keith Lynch of the news site Stuff in New Zealand. I know much of the world will be thinking about your country today. Thank you so much for the time this morning.
No problem.
So here's a question. Who is responsible for a mass shooting? And could that list include the manufacture of a gun. A court here in the United States has been grappling with that very question.
Right. Yesterday, the Connecticut State Supreme Court ruled that families of those killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2011 can move forward with a lawsuit against the gun manufacturer, Remington. One of Remington's assault-style firearms was used by the gunman in the massacre that happened in Newtown, Connecticut. It left 20 children dead, 6 educators as well. Ian Hockley lost his 6-year-old son Dylan in that attack. He is part of this lawsuit, and he spoke after the judge's decision came down.
I can't say I'm excited by this ruling. I wish I was never here. But what we've said from the outset is, all we want is our day in court, for the law to be upheld, and for a jury to decide our case.
Davis Donovan is a reporter for member station WSHU and has been following this case. Davis, thanks for being here.
Thank you, David.
So tell me exactly what these families are hoping to sue Remington for. How would this legal case work?
Right. So they started this lawsuit as a wrongful death lawsuit against Remington because, as you said, Remington makes the Bushmaster AR-15 style rifle that was used in the shooting. And what they're really interested in is a part of this that's called wrongful marketing. So the family's attorneys pointed to some ads from Remington that showed the rifle with a slogan that said, "Consider your man card reissued," or ads that show a lone gunman on a battlefield. And they say, also Remington marketed this directly toward young people. They say they basically get product placement in violent first-person shooter video games like Call of Duty.
Okay, so the Supreme Court seemed, convinced by some of the arguments here, and this follows a lot of battles in lower courts. It was, just listening to that father there, it's how would you ever be excited about something like this? But are they feeling like at least there's a path forward now?
Right. Yeah, they are. And, that's what they've said essentially is they want gun companies like Remington to be able to be held accountable. Originally a lower court struck this down because of a 2005 federal law that said, gun manufacturers aren't liable for shootings that are committed with their guns. Another one of the parents on the lawsuit is David Wheeler, and his son, Ben Wheeler, was one of the children who died in the shooting. And here's what he had to say.
There is a reason this particular consumer product is the one that is used by people who want to inflict the most damage. That reason very likely partially resides at the feet of the manufacturers in their advertising and marketing policies.
And then another family member named Bill Sherlock, whose wife was a psychologist at Sandy Hook, he said he expects to spend the rest of his life on this avenue in one way, shape, or form.
So it sounds like this case might have real implications, not just for Remington, but other gun manufacturers as well in terms of how they market their products to people.
Right. So first, obviously, it establishes a precedent. It opens up the possibility that gun manufacturers could be sued in other state courts after shootings. But also, if and when this goes to court now, attorneys can get discovery. And that means they can get Remington's documents, like memos, emails having to do with marketing. And then they might get a clear picture of what goes on behind the scenes at gun companies when they're deciding how to market the guns. And that's what the 9 families and the 1 survivor involved in this lawsuit have said they really want to see.
Davis Donovan reports from NPR's member station WSHU. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Now, news in Washington. Ahead of a key vote on the National Emergency Declaration, President Trump sent a message to Republican senators. The message was stay united.
Yeah, and that demand failed on Thursday. In a rare bipartisan rebuke of this White House, 12 Republican senators broke from their party. They aligned with Democrats and blocked the president's efforts to divert funds for a border wall. Here's one of those senators, Republican Rob Portman from Ohio.
Congress, not the president, has the sole authority to determine how to spend taxpayer money.
Vote was 59-41, and it sets up the first veto of the Trump presidency.
And NPR White House correspondent Aisha Roscoe is with us. Good morning, Aisha.
Good morning.
So how big a setback is this for President Trump?
Well, policy-wise, it's not really a huge setback. You had 12 Republican senators voting with Democrats, but that's not enough to override a veto. Trump tweeted right after the vote, in all caps, one word, veto. Mm-hmm. So that's where this is headed. But it's a setback in the sense that a dozen members of Trump's own party went against him on his signature issue, immigration. To have that many Republicans rebuff this declaration in the face of Trump actively lobbying members to hold the line, it's a sign that Republicans are pushing back. Now, obviously, Republicans are going to stick with Trump overall. There's no doubt about that. But this shows that there may be some limits.
And why were the limits here? We're not talking about one or two Republicans. I mean, this is a sizable number of Republicans. Why did they decide to take a stand on this issue?
What many of these Republicans were saying is that they support Trump, they support the wall, but they're against this idea of using an emergency declaration to access funds that Congress refused to appropriate. They said they wanted to protect Congress's authority. Here's Republican Senator Lamar Alexander making that point.
Our nation's founders gave to Congress the power to approve all spending so that the president would not have too much power. This check on the executive is a source of our freedom.
So what these senators seem to really be getting at with these votes is that there will be life after Trump. And if you approve this sort of authority for Trump, then you open the door to when a Democrat at some point gets in the White House using this authority potentially to kind of take on issues like climate change without including Congress. And that's what these Republicans didn't want to happen.
Which is an argument that did not persuade President Trump or the White House. And you know, Aisha, this is a president who does not hold back in going after people who stand in his way. Are there going to be consequences potentially for being a Republican who voted against this president?
At this point, Trump has not directly addressed those that went against him. But look, he's likely not pleased. And he's someone who demands loyalty, and he takes these votes very personally. Ahead of this vote, he was saying it's about border security, and he warned that a vote in favor of this was a vote in favor of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So it's unlikely he's going to go after all 12 of these senators, but he's known to kind of hold grudges. I mean, he's still talking about John McCain not voting on health care all those years ago.
Oh, that's right. So he's going to veto it, and then what happens after that?
This is going to be in the courts. And so ultimately, the courts will decide whether this is an appropriate action for the president to take.
Okay. NPR White House correspondent Aisha Roscoe. Thanks, Aisha.
Thank you.
There were fathers, wives, sons. Some had moved to New Zealand for a better life. Some had built their lives in New Zealand. Over the weekend, thousands of people gathered to remember them and all of the 50 people who were killed in the attacks on 2 mosques Friday.
The suspected gunman survived, and his court-appointed lawyer tells reporters that the suspect plans to represent himself in court. He is the author of a lengthy screed that described immigrants as invaders, a screed that he sent to the office of New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. The Prime Minister's cabinet has agreed in principle to tighten the gun laws.
We go now to NPR's Rob Schmitz, who is in Christchurch. Rob, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Good morning.
I understand you've been talking to survivors and victims, families over the weekend. What have those conversations been like?
They're obviously very emotional, a lot of crying, a lot of tears. Today I was with family members and friends who are finally starting to receive the bodies of their loved ones from the hospital. The sheer number of the dead and the way they've died has made identifying these bodies a difficult and time-consuming process for authorities, for hospital staff, and what's made this situation even more pressing is the Muslim tradition of burying the deceased as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. I met a man named Kokan Mia, an immigrant from Bangladesh who lost 4 close friends. I met Kokan as he was waiting outside the hospital for their bodies, and here's what he said about one of them. And Rachel, he's saying here that his friend Hosne was like a mother to the tiny Bangladeshi community here. She helped teach the Quran, she helped work as a midwife, she helped solve marital disputes. Her husband is in a wheelchair, and she was shot and killed soon after wheeling him into one of the mosques. He incredibly survived, but Kokan says losing her feels like losing his own mother.
And there were so many others who were injured, right, in this attack who are still in the hospital?
Yeah, there were around 50 people injured. More than 24 of them remain in the hospital. 9 people are in critical condition, including another friend of Kokan, the man we just heard from. The 25-year-old wife of his roommate was shot in the chest twice and is miraculously still alive. He told me she has a 50-50 chance of surviving.
What about this debate now, or is it even a debate over the gun laws in New Zealand?
Well, it's not that much of a debate. I mean, it is a complicated issue because many New Zealanders own guns. There's nearly one gun for every 3 citizens here. Many people I've spoken to, though, agree that assault rifles like the AR-15, which was used in this attack, should be banned, and that very well could be the outcome from New Zealand's government. I spoke to Andrew Taylor today. He owns a gun shop in Christchurch, and he told me he's refusing to sell certain guns, as well as the magazines that enable them to shoot more bullets.
Anyone can buy those magazines. They're just not allowed to put them in their gun. But if they do, what can we do? So we've pulled the sales of those, and we've pulled the sales of all of our AR platform guns until we hear further notice from the police or the government to what we are supposed to do.
And Rachel, that includes the AR-15. He's no longer selling that, despite the fact that his phone has been ringing off the hook since the shooting from people who want to buy that gun because they're scared it's going to be banned soon.
Sounds familiar. We've seen that repeated here in the U.S.
That's right.
NPR's Rob Schmitz reporting from Christchurch, New Zealand. Rob, thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
U.S. officials commonly say this country sets the gold standard for aviation safety. So how did an apparent problem with Boeing airplanes elude the notice of safety inspectors?
The Seattle Times was posing that question even before the second of 2 crashes of Boeing planes. The local paper in a city where Boeing has big facilities examined interactions between Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA inspects the airplane maker for safety concerns, but it works in close collaboration with Boeing. And when it came to safety of 737 MAX planes, documents show the FAA told engineers to delegate wide responsibility to the company itself. Some engineers identified flaws in the safety analysis of a flight control system that is suspected in 2 crashes.
The investigation at the Seattle Times was done by Dominic Gates, an aerospace reporter for the paper. He joins us on the line from Seattle. Dominic, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Rachel.
I think it's probably a good starting point to just have you explain how it can be that federal authorities outsource the safety investigations to a particular company, in this case Boeing. I mean, how is that even allowed to happen?
Well, I have to tell you that that's the norm these days. The FAA, lacking funding and resources, has delegated more and more of the work of certification to industry. And in fact, Congress has told the FAA to do so. The FAA Reauthorization Act last year said that they should delegate as much as possible unless there's an identified safety reason not to. The onus is on the FAA to find a reason not to delegate. It is the normal way it works these days.
So what happened in this particular case? You say there was a failure of oversight.
Well, when the 737 MAX, the plane in question, was certified by the FAA, a document was produced called the System Safety Analysis, and that's one of the things that was delegated to Boeing. So Boeing engineers who are authorized to work for the FAA prepared that document. Now, I spoke with current and former engineers directly involved with the evaluations or familiar with the document, and they pointed to at least three major flaws in the system safety analysis.
And so the FAA had outsourced this safety assessment. The Boeing comes back with the assessment, but there are flaws in what? The data, the reporting, and the FAA overlooks them?
Well, apparently they were overlooked. Actually, these 3 flaws Boeing is now scrambling to fix. The very ones that I wrote about in my story, Boeing is now preparing a software patch that will fix all 3 things that the engineers spoke to me about. We know that because last week the FAA briefed people in Congress who are connected with the aviation subcommittees about the details of what the fix is. And so they told us, we're going to make sure that the system can't be triggered by just a single sensor, as in fact it was, a sensor that was faulty.
One quick question about this, if I might. Your story says that you first told Boeing what you'd learned 11 days ago, which was before the second crash. Are you saying that you had informed Boeing of what engineers were saying that they didn't seem to know before the second crash in which many people died?
Yes, I sent details of everything I was going to say in the story on March 6th. That was 4 days before the second crash. And Boeing was working on getting me answers. Well, I said, this is what the story is going to say. I need your input. I need you to comment on what I'm saying. And they were working on that when the second crash happened.
And you, at this point, have you heard from Boeing?
They got back to me late Saturday, the afternoon before the story published. And they didn't say much. They just said that they weren't able to comment on the details because of the ongoing investigation. They did say there are some mischaracterizations, significant mischaracterizations in the description I'd given, but they didn't say what, and they haven't said anything since the story was published.
Dominic Gates, aerospace reporter for the Seattle Times. Obviously, we'll continue to follow this. Thank you so much for sharing your reporting with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Small towns across the U.S. Midwest are flooding in a way that hasn't happened in decades.
This all started as a late winter storm. Last week, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Iowa experienced blizzard conditions, hurricane-like winds and heavy rain, and then came the flooding. Here is Nebraska State Senator Tom Brees.
I think events like this can be the death knell of some small communities in our state. And yes, the future of these communities does hang in the balance after an event like this.
Bill Kelly is a reporter for our member station, NET Radio. He's been reporting from some of the state's hardest hit areas and joins us now. So, Bill, you were out, I understand, in central Nebraska. What'd you see?
The most striking thing is how difficult it is to get from point A and point B in the north and east central parts of the state. Many of the state highways and bridges have been damaged, washed out completely in some cases. What's usually maybe a half-hour drive from town to town in these counties can take up to 2 hours on back roads. And then once you get to towns like Dannebrog and St. Edward, where I visited, the streets are lined with household goods or goods from stores. They're out on the curb. They're muddy. They're waterlogged. And everybody in town has generators and pumps going. It's all hands on deck as far as volunteers in these communities.
How did it get so bad so quickly? Because it does seem like it turned fast.
It did, and it shouldn't be too surprising that there are floods in Nebraska. We're used to floods in concentrated areas. This is a state with 80,000 miles of rivers. That's more rivers than any other state in the union. But all these creeks and rivers all lead to the Missouri and the Platte. What was unusual in this case is hundreds of them flooded all at once. First, there was this unprecedented event with record snowfalls out here, and then this bomb cyclone we've been hearing about added more snow with a blizzard. But on the eastern part of the state, also heavy rains that melted 2 months worth of snow all at once. And the result was all of that melted snow entered those creeks and streams all at once, and those led down to the larger rivers, and the floodwaters have pretty much receded on the north end of the state, and now the real problem is concentrating down in the Missouri River, and they're going to be starting to feel those effects down in Missouri downstream.
How does recovery begin? Because we heard that state senator say that this can be, in his words, a death knell to small towns.
It's a real concern when there's this much damage all at once. We visited the town of St. Edward. It's about a town of 800 people. Like I said, the volunteer response has been great. But they've every business in town. They have 31 stores and diners and offices along their main street. And then there were a couple of dozen homes that were badly damaged, and those may need to be demolished completely. That's a huge part of the housing stock in a town of only 800 people. And they are now going to be competing with the state resources.
And they're going to have to find new places to live. Bill Kelly of NET Radio.
New Zealand is deciding what it will and won't do in response to a mass shooting.
We know one thing the Prime Minister will not do. Jacinda Ardern tells her country's parliament she doesn't want to give publicity to the man accused of killing 50 people inside 2 mosques.
He is a terrorist. He is a criminal. He is an extremist. But he will, when I speak, be nameless.
Next comes the question of what the government will do. Ardern has promised new gun laws, so what do gun owners think about that?
That question resonates with the gun debate here in the United States. So let's go to NPR's Rob Schmitz. He's been hearing that debate as it sounds in Christchurch, New Zealand. Hi there, Rob.
Good morning, Steve.
What are you hearing?
Well, I've heard mixed feelings from the people I've spoken to this week. This afternoon, I visited Gun City. It's the biggest retailer in New Zealand, and it's where the attacker bought some of his guns. They've gotten a bit of media attention, so they did not want to talk to me. But there was a group of guys who were at the counter when I was there. They were purchasing an AR-15. Now, that's the type of semi-automatic rifle that was used in Friday's attack. And since they were in a hurry to go hunt on a hunting trip, one of them gave me his number so that I could interview him over the phone. His name is Thomas Jones. He owns a hunting business here. He owns 12 guns. 4 of them are semi-automatics that could very well be banned soon. He told me he wished New Zealand had an organization like the NRA that could stand up for gun owners like him, and here's what he said.
It's really disappointing to have the government throw on us what one person did and punish 250,000 gun owners at least, if not more, just because of what one man done.
And that man he's referring to was not a New Zealander. He was from Australia, and that really bothers Jones because he says New Zealanders grew up owning guns. Many people hunt, and they respect them.
Rob, I'm curious. You said there was a group of guys that they or one of them was purchasing an AR-15 on the way to a hunting trip. Are they going to hunt with the AR-15?
Well, he hunts goats, which are invasive species to New Zealand. He sometimes gets hired by the government to do this, and he told me that these goats apparently are so rampant in New Zealand that they have to manage their numbers, and so that's why he wants to hold on to his AR-15.
Okay, so these guys are not rushing to turn in semi-automatic rifles, at least this little group of men. Is this a widespread sentiment among gun owners where you are?
No. In fact, most of the gun owners I spoke with here agreed that semi-automatic weapons should be restricted after this tragedy. One gun owner admitted to me that he only has an AR-15 because it's fun to shoot, he told me, and he'd be happy turning it in once the government asks him to. Another man I met today, Robert Miller, is a gun owner who told me he used to own a semi-automatic handgun, but after a month he got rid of it because he thought it was too dangerous to have in his house. Here's what he thinks should happen in the wake of last week's tragedy.
Well, to be honest, I think the all military-style semi-automatic should be banned. There's no need for them. Probably the same with pistols, to be honest. Gun registration, I think we need it because there's just no way of tracking a gun here if it's sold. Someone could sell it on to a guy without a license, and there's no record of it being sold.
Well, that raises a question. What gun laws, if any, does New Zealand have now?
Well, it's relatively easy to purchase a gun here. Anyone over the age of 16 can apply for a license at a police station. And after a background check, you have to take a 3-hour class, police check references, and then you've got a license. One problem I've been hearing over and over is that even though semi-automatic weapons are restricted to 7-bullet magazines and it's illegal to modify them with magazines that can hold more bullets, anyone here can buy a high-capacity magazine which can hold up to 30 bullets. You don't need a gun license to buy that, and once you do, it's technically illegal to attach that magazine to your gun, but there's no enforcement of this whatsoever, and this is how the Christchurch attacker was able to get around the law. But that is a loophole that every gun owner that I spoke to agreed should be closed.
Well, that is remarkable because somehow the law envisions that people would buy that high-capacity magazine for some purpose other than putting it onto a weapon. You're saying it is legal to just buy the magazine.
It is, and I think that is exactly what lawmakers in New Zealand are looking at this week before they come out with new gun reforms next week.
Rob, thanks for your excellent work. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
That's NPR's Rob Schmitz. What will Midwestern residents see when the water recedes from their towns?
All this flooding was triggered by a winter storm that happened last week. Melting snow is the problem. This melting snow turned to water, overflowed the rivers in Wisconsin and Missouri and Peru, Nebraska, where we found Tim Potter.
This is my hometown, and I've never seen it get this high. Never. Them rivers only hold so much. That river's angry.
Vice President Mike Pence is going to visit Nebraska today.
Okay, so Nebraska, Wisconsin, Missouri, and then there is Iowa, which is where we find reporter Katie Pikus of Iowa Public Radio. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
What have you been seeing in the last couple of days moving around Iowa?
Over the weekend, I drove into Hornick, a city in western Iowa that had to evacuate for a few days after water overtopped a levee. And there were just so many oh wow moments, flooded fields, garages that looked like they were just kind of a little house floating on a lake, mud in so many places.
And the people who you said had to evacuate, where did they go? Where'd you find them?
They either went to nearby communities. A lot of them had family in the area. A lot of them went to hotels in the area. Some even went to a shelter in the area, but mostly stayed with family and friends.
And when you look out across this town, you see not just fields and garages, but were there homes that appeared to be flooded, potentially destroyed?
There were homes that had, 4 feet of water in their basements.
Okay, so that is one town in Iowa that you had a good look at. Is there a lot of Iowa that is underwater or has been at some point over the last few days?
Quite a bit. In Missouri Valley, Iowa, a town a little bit southwest, they even had to evacuate people by boat because the water was so bad around there.
Wow, New Orleans style situation there for a moment. Any idea how long the floods are going to last where you are?
We do have a little bit of light rain expected in some parts of Iowa today, which the National Weather Service in Sioux Falls said really won't have much of an impact to the rivers here, but there is some rain in the forecast this weekend, plus some snowmelt that, could rise these river levels a little bit. And a meteorologist I spoke with on Sunday said the threat of flooding really could linger for another 4 to 6 weeks, and all of that snowpack in the region just needs to melt, and that will happen as temperatures warm.
The threat of flooding, meaning that even if the water has gone down in your community, you don't know, might come back over the next few weeks.
It could.
All right, well, Katie, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Katie Pikus of Iowa Public Radio. Some other news. Who will cooperate with a massive House investigation of people around the president?
Right. And cooperation is not exactly optional here. The House Judiciary Committee has subpoena power, though people can try to resist. The committee requested documents from more than 80 people and entities. The committee chairman, Gerald Nadler, told MSNBC that at least one former presidential advisor said yes.
We've gotten responses from surprising people, like, for instance, Bannon, who sent us a few thousand documents.
What about people still in the White House? Well, NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith is covering that part of the story. Hi there, Tam.
Hi.
Did the administration answer by Nadler's deadline, which I think was yesterday, right?
That is correct. The deadline was yesterday, but the response has not yet been forthcoming. We are told to expect a response and that we shouldn't expect it to be a, hey, thank you so much for asking. Here's everything you ever asked for. Mm-hmm. Instead, it is likely to be a combative response. The White House felt that Nadler and his committee were overreaching. They described it earlier when the letters first went out as a disgraceful abuse and a fishing expedition. And they've been responding to other congressional demands in similarly combative ways. The Trump campaign, I checked in with them yesterday, and they said that they have responded to the committee, but they wouldn't say how they responded and simply referred me to a statement that they put out when the initial request was made. And in that statement, they called the investigation a dramatic overreach, an abuse of power, and a witch hunt.
Does all of this suggest a confrontational approach then once the White House gets around to actually answering?
You know, what's really interesting here is that Nadler, the committee chairman, came out and said that the committee has already received tens of thousands of documents. A large number of the individuals and entities have responded, and that they are moving forward, and that they plan to negotiate with those who haven't been responsive yet and find ways to get what they need. That is very different than the message that is coming from the White House itself. Though, not publicly yet, except for that statement earlier, the sort of the White House response is far more combative. And of course, you had previously the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, out there beating up on the Mueller investigation. And that is sort of the direction that it seems to be going. So you have Nadler saying things are moving forward. It's going to be fine. And White House allies making it seem like this is going to be a fight. And I think that is really setting up the tone for the days and weeks ahead. Democrats want to make it look like this investigation is working, and the president and his allies want to make it look like this investigation is a witch hunt.
I want to check a detail of this, Tamara. Of course, Nadler has requested an immense amount of documents from a very large number of people, but didn't Nadler also say, all you really have to do is send me the stuff you've already sent to the special counsel? So take that email, hit forward, send it to me. And on one level, is this an achievable request if people are willing to do it?
Yes, that is what Nadler is saying. And one of the people I talked to who did respond to him yesterday said exactly that. He's like, I already gave stuff to the special counsel. Here you go.
Tamara, thanks for the update. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That's NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith.
The FAA has been without a permanent chief for more than a year. That soon may change, though.
Because President Trump has nominated Stephen Dixon for that job. He's a former Delta Airlines pilot and executive. If confirmed by the Senate, he will head an agency facing criticism after the crashes of 2 Boeing planes. One question facing the agency is this: were regulators too cozy with Boeing as they analyzed the safety of the 737 MAX?
Andy Pastor is a senior special writer for the Wall Street Journal who has followed Dixon's career, and he joins us now. Andy, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
Tell us a little about why Stephen Dixon is the guy for this job, or the president thinks he is.
So on paper, his qualifications are really excellent. 27 years at Delta, an Air Force Academy graduate, steeped in the air safety world for many years. The question really is whether he has the attitude and the vision to take the FAA to the next level, to the next stage. He's a compromise candidate, a mainstream candidate. The president really wanted his former corporate pilot and
the president's own former personal private corporate pilot.
That's exactly right. And the transportation secretary and others in the industry convinced him that you needed somebody with management experience. So Mr. Dixon has that. But the issue is the FAA is facing so many challenges overseas and domestically. And do you really want somebody who's going to be following the old script or someone with a different view? And we'll see what happens. The administration will portray this as a cleaning of the house after all the controversy swirling around the agency and all the issues related to these 2 crashes. There will be other personnel shakeups, I think, for sure, over the next couple of months. And it still is an open question as to whether this is a fundamental change or just a titular head and basically the same agency.
Well, is there anything in his background to suggest that he would hold the industry accountable? After all, as Steve noted, the central tension here is how close the FAA was to Boeing in terms of their safety check process.
So let's put this in a little bit of context. The safety record in the U.S. has been absolutely phenomenal, better than anybody ever imagined in the safety world. 26 million flights a year, almost 1 billion passengers, and for almost a decade, not a single passenger fatality. So those are the accomplishments. The challenges, because of these 2 crashes, are really huge. The FAA has lost its stature overseas, much of it, because countries acted on their own to ground these jets, and now the Europeans and the Canadians are saying we're going to check the safety of these jets before we let them back in the air, regardless of what the FAA says. Mr. Dixon has a strong history of basically supporting the industry and keeping to the industry's basic philosophy. And so the issue is, when he comes over to the FAA, will there be changes, both systematic and personnel changes?
Just briefly, with the time we have remaining, there are some moves happening in the investigation, the broader investigation about these 737 MAX 8 airplanes. The Department of Transportation is asking for an audit of the FAA's approval, and the Justice Department is opening a criminal probe. What can you tell us about those developments?
So what we have happening are a confluence of events that the industry has not seen, and certainly in many decades. Criminal investigation is almost unheard of for issues related to regulatory changes and regulatory decisions made by the FAA. There are also the Transportation Department's Inspector General is looking at how the plane was certified, and now there's an audit going back and looking at exactly who did what.
Okay,
so
we're going to
see results.
And as you note, this is unprecedented in several ways. Wall Street Journal senior special writer Andy Pastor talking to us on Skype. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, we turn now to West Virginia, where the Catholic Diocese is facing accusations of knowingly employing pedophiles.
Yeah, State Attorney General Patrick Morrissey says that when church officials faced evidence of abuse, they did a lot more than just look the other way.
We allege that the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston persisted in covering up and keeping secret criminal behavior of priests relating to sexual abuse of children.
The lawsuit filed yesterday concerns the only Roman Catholic diocese in West Virginia. It says the bishop allowed priests to keep working in churches, schools, and camps even after they were accused of criminal behavior.
Glynis Board is the Assistant News Director for West Virginia Public Broadcasting. She joins us now to talk about this. Glynis, can you give us more specifics about these allegations?
Sure. Well, there are two separate investigations, or there have been recently, three if you count the Attorney General's. And let's see, the diocese began an internal investigation sometime last year. And then in September, the diocese bishop, Michael Bransfield, well, he turned 75 years old, and his custom, he resigned. And Rome then accepted his resignation unusually fast and also launched at the same time its own investigation into allegations that Bransfield sexually harassed adults. Now, at that point, the Attorney General sort of signaled that he wanted to investigate, but it wasn't clear that he had, really, until yesterday's announcement. Now, in November, the diocese released what they found during their internal probe in what they called an effort to build back trust. They released this list of all the credibly accused names that they've been made aware of in the last 70 years, and that was 18 former clergy, and that list included their assignments.
Huh. And this is a civil suit, though. The AG suit is not criminal.
Yeah, that's sort of what separates this from a lot of the other suits that have been recently, set against different priests throughout the country and in different states. It seems that the Attorney General hopes that this might be a more successful prosecution than those criminal complaints. And of course, criminal complaints can often get hung up because of the statute of limitations.
So this is a string of abuse over a lot of years, allegedly. How's the diocese responding?
They are challenging the allegations. A statement released yesterday indicates that there's questions about timelines and whether accused priests were in fact knowingly placed in schools, as the lawsuit contends. And they say that there's a zero tolerance policy that's been in place for more than a decade. And they say that a lot of the details in the lawsuit came from their released documents, and that some of those allegations were not accurately described, and that some of them are more than 50 years old.
Glynis Board of West Virginia Public Broadcasting talking to us on Skype. Glynis, thanks for sharing your reporting on this.
Thanks very much.
Early this morning, the mouse swallowed the fox.
As of midnight, the familiar theme of 21st Century Fox is owned by the makers of this other familiar theme. Don't know about you, but I'm just barely keeping from singing along. Anyway, Disney, the home of Mickey Mouse, and ESPN, and a lot more acquired 21st Century Fox today.
NPR TV critic Eric Deggans is here to sort through the implications of this mega merger. Hey, Eric.
We're so lucky that Steve didn't sing.
Right? I'm glad you said it.
Eric,
I didn't have to.
Eric, be careful. I could break into song at any time, Eric.
Focus.
Let's go.
Focus.
Oh, yes. There's a story. Please
what does
proceed.
Disney get out of this deal, Eric?
Well, it's a $71.3 billion deal. It involves two of the biggest studios in Hollywood. So, it involves a lot of names in TV and film you already know. So Disney gets outlets like 20th Century Fox Television, which produces shows like Empire and Modern Family, along with Fox Animation and National Geographic partners. Fox, meanwhile, has created this standalone company called Fox Corporation that includes the Fox Broadcast Network, Fox News Channel, Fox Business Network, Fox Sports. In fact, former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan named to that new Fox Corporation's board.
Right, I saw that.
So wait a minute. So Fox News stays with Rupert Murdoch and his family and not with Disney, right?
Exactly.
So this deal was announced a while ago, December 2017. Why did it take so long to close?
Well, it's one of the biggest media deals in recent history. You got these regulatory agencies across the world that had to sign off on this deal, including the U.S. Department of Justice, which made Disney sell off several regional sports networks that were owned by Fox, just to keep them from dominating too much of the sports TV industry here.
So this has got to be something that's going to bring a lot of change to TV and film, the industries, right? What's going to happen?
Well, behind the scenes, we've already heard about big executive changes, right? Top TV executives from Fox are moving over to lead television at Disney. A top executive at AMC was named to head entertainment at this streamlined Fox. But lower down the ladder, there's lots of anxiety in Hollywood that thousands of people will likely lose their jobs when Disney starts to consolidate its film and TV properties.
Right. I mean, that sort of happens when two huge companies merge.
With a lot of redundancies.
With a lot of redundancies, right. So what about us? This is really what it's about. I mean, sympathy to those who may lose their jobs, obviously, but how's it going to affect what we watch?
Well, Disney is going to bulk up, right? I mean, it's going to become the home of everything from The Simpsons to Star Wars, and that's going to provide a lot of content for this new streaming service that they're putting together called Disney Plus. Disney also gets a bigger stake in Hulu. So Hulu can be a home to more adult fare like the Deadpool movies, while Disney Plus is going to have more family-friendly fare. Comic fans are going to love seeing superheroes from the Marvel Universe in the same corporate home with 20th Century Fox's Deadpool and X-Men characters at Disney. Whatever happens, I'm expecting to see a lot of real change at Disney-owned ABC Network and the Fox Broadcast Network next year after they've had about 12 months or more than 12 months to really figure out what the program is going to look like on those broadcast networks. Even more new programming in lots of different places.
Okay, that part sounds good. NPR's Eric Deggans. We should mention 21st Century Fox and Walt Disney Pictures are corporate sponsors to NPR. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Gun control advocates in the United States sometimes ask, how many mass shootings will it take before the country acts? New Zealand's government has now given its own answer to that question.
It took one mass shooting, an attack on 2 mosques that killed 50 people. It was the first such event in New Zealand in many years. The Prime Minister there, Jacinda Ardern, says her cabinet has now worked out new gun laws that will be moved swiftly through the Parliament.
New Zealand will ban all military-style semi-automatic weapons. We will also ban all assault rifles. We will ban all high-capacity magazines.
Ardern also announced a gun amnesty and a buyback program so owners can hand in their weapons.
NPR's Rob Schmitz has been in Christchurch, New Zealand, covering this story and is on the line. Hi, Rob.
Good morning.
When she says semi-automatic weapons, assault rifles, how are they defining the weapons to be banned?
Well, they're banning the weapons that are capable of being used with a detachable magazine that can hold more than 5 cartridges. And so these include what are known as military-style semi-automatics, guns like the AR-15, which was used in the Christchurch attack, and semi-automatic shotguns that are also used with a detachable magazine, which was used also in the attack on the 2 mosques here. New Zealand also banned, as you mentioned, high-capacity magazines, which can hold up to 30 rounds of ammunition. Up to now, it was legal for anyone with or without a gun license to buy and sell high-capacity magazines in New Zealand.
Well, Rob, I'm thinking just the other day you brought us the story of someone at a gun shop in New Zealand who had just bought, I think, an AR-15. So what happens to the people who currently own these weapons?
Yes, that gentleman and others are going to have to hand in those guns pretty soon. According to the government, among the 1.5 million guns in New Zealand, there are 13,500 guns that are now banned. And for the folks who own them, they'll be required to go online, register with the police to set up a time when they can come back into their police station and hand their guns in.
In return, they're going to get money back. If they do not comply, they could face up to a few years in prison. So this buyback program is estimated to cost the government up to around $140 million. And what's interesting about today's news is that the government announced this is just the first step. Later this month, the government will announce new rules for obtaining a gun license, storing your gun, and more severe penalties for not complying with gun regulations inside New Zealand.
It's a democracy, of course, so we should just check this. Is this correct? The cabinet has approved this. It goes to the parliament. They still have to vote, but there doesn't seem to be any doubt that parliament's going to vote on this stuff, right?
The main opposition party has completely signed off on this verbally today.
And how are other people responding across the country?
Well, by and large, the people I've spoken to today after the ban was announced were in complete agreement with their government and their prime minister. I spent some time this afternoon at the makeshift shrine at the Christchurch Botanical Gardens for the victims of the attack. I spoke to John Overend, who had driven here in the countryside to show his support. He's a gun owner, and I asked him what he thought of the semi-automatic weapons ban.
Good idea. I'm a farmer and I've got guns, but just for pests and things like that. But semi-automatics aren't what you use for shooting pests. They're for killing people.
And I've been asking questions about guns to folks here all week, and I've been struck by how many people here in the gun industry also agreed that semi-automatics should be banned. One gun owner I spoke to had taken all his weapons off the shelves the day of the attack, and he stopped selling high-capacity magazines. The manager of the rifle range the alleged attacker was a member of also told me that he shut down his gun club to show respect for the victims.
Rob, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Rob Schmitz. In this country, Donald Trump, who did not serve in Vietnam, has spent years now heckling John McCain, who did.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
And I'm a loyalist. I'm a person that, like, if somebody is with me, I'm with that person. And John McCain was very disloyal to me.
Those remarks by Trump dating back years. It is increasingly clear that President Trump is unable to stop talking about John McCain, even now that the war hero is dead. The president spoke yesterday at a defense manufacturing plant in Ohio. He complained that McCain's family never thanked him for approving the details of McCain's memorial service.
So I have to be honest, I've never liked him much. Hasn't been for me. I've really probably never will.
NPR lead political editor Domenico Montanaro is covering this story. Domenico, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
I guess it's not a surprise the president would go on in this way. He holds on to grievances. We know that from his behavior for years. But why would there be this eruption about John McCain just now?
Right. Well, there were court filings unsealed last week that detailed McCain's role during the 2016 campaign distributing what's known as the Steele dossier. That's the compilation of salacious accusations against Trump that linked him to Russia, was paid for by political opponents. Once those details came out, the president went on a Twitter attack over the weekend. He hit McCain. That led to his daughter, Meghan McCain, firing back at the president, and the president continuing his attacks even yesterday against McCain. And remember, McCain has acknowledged his role in turning the dossier over to the FBI. He said to verify it. He wrote a book last year that said he had an obligation to do so because he could not assess what was true or not. He would do it again and said, quote, anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell.
So when the president who got out of service in Vietnam because of, I think, bone spurs, criticizes a man who was tortured in prison after being shot down over Vietnam, how do his fellow Republicans respond?
Well, most notably, what triggered Trump yesterday was Georgia Senator Johnny Isakson. He's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. He jumped to McCain's defense, and here he is speaking to Georgia Public Broadcasting.
It's deplorable what he said. That's what I called it from the floor of the Senate 7 months ago. It will be deplorable 7 months from now if he says it again, and I will continue to speak out.
So he's not mincing words there. He even used that word deplorable,
Yeah.
and that's not unintentional. That's to get the president's attention. That's that word that Hillary Clinton used during the campaign, you might remember, to describe half of Trump's supporters. And other top Republicans came to McCain's defense, although not all were as hotly critical of the president himself.
Some, like Mitch McConnell, praised McCain without mentioning Trump at all, if I'm not mistaken. But those supporters, is it likely that he would lose any supporters at all, even some of the senators who criticize him?
Well, it's really been a fool's errand to try and predict when, if, or how the president's base would abandon him. Remember, though, attacks against McCain were the first big thing that people thought would derail his campaign. You played that clip at the top earlier. It's been 4 years since that, since he lashed out against McCain. And after the election, Trump's campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, said he thought when he heard that when he heard what Trump said, he thought the campaign was over. Of course, it wasn't. Trump won the election. I think the big question people are wondering is if there's some kind of fatigue, because it'll set the backdrop for 2020.
Domenico, thanks.
You're welcome.
NPR's Domenico Montanaro. Some new numbers released overnight are painting an even darker picture of the opioid epidemic.
The data comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and it highlights how one particularly destructive drug, the synthetic opioid fentanyl, is killing Americans at an unprecedented rate. Overdose deaths involving fentanyl have increased exponentially. It's taking a toll on specific communities. The new report shows men and people of color are being hit hardest.
Martha Biebinger is a reporter for NPR's member station WBUR in Boston. She covers healthcare, and she's on the line. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
So I'm thinking about specific communities. We just heard people of color. The opioid epidemic has been portrayed in the media as something striking mostly white, mostly rural communities. Is this something different?
This is different. This is not what we are seeing with fentanyl. With fentanyl, it is blacks who are seeing the fastest rates of death increase. Latinos are second, and then whites.
So we're talking about different demographic groups. Is this also affecting different areas of the country? Is this rural problem being redefined as an urban problem?
Well, there are the area with the fastest rate of increase is New England. And so that mixes both rural and urban areas. The reason that some researchers think New England has been hardest hit is, well, there's a couple of things. One is that it has a long-standing problem with opioid use. And maybe drug dealers were sort of targeting this market to test fentanyl early on. Another thought is that the powdered form of heroin that fentanyl started to replace, it's easier to mix those white crystals into the powdered form than it is into the black tar heroin that's more common in the western part of the country.
Not to get too tied up in the details and the technicalities, but you're telling me that people are blending drugs together like putting ethanol in your gasoline, and that is one of the ways that fentanyl has been spreading here.
Yes, fentanyl is so powerful, Steve, that just a few crystals mixed into what might have been a bag of heroin can be enough to stop breathing within just a few seconds.
Okay, let's look at another demographic trend that you see in these numbers. Far more men than women affected. Why would that be?
Well, there are a couple of theories. One is that men are more likely to use drugs alone. And when you use drugs alone with fentanyl, because it's so powerful, your risk of death rises greatly. Another reason, Steve, is that women are more likely to see doctors. They're more likely to ask for help. They're more likely to call 911 and seek treatment. So the public health people who've reviewed this data say that means we need to be careful to get men connected with somebody who will get them into treatment, whether it's an outreach worker, a needle exchange program. Any touch point in the healthcare system will help this problem specifically for men.
So we have more information about the opioid epidemic. We also have different information about the opioid epidemic. It challenges us to think about this epidemic in different ways. Does it challenge health experts to think about solutions differently?
Many health experts say this data points to the need for some fairly radical changes, like supervised consumption sites. Those are rooms where medical personnel oversee people who are using drugs. That's way too radical for many people in the country, but public health experts will tell you that's the direction we need to head.
Martha Biebinger of WBUR, thanks.
Thank you.
This story begins in 1967, when Israel was at war with much of the Arab world. Israeli soldiers seized a patch of land from Syria. It's land President Trump now says they never need to give back.
For half a century, the United Nations has said that borderland should be returned, which is why it was news when the president tweeted yesterday that the United States should fully recognize Israel's sovereignty in the Golan Heights. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a miracle.
He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty. But now he did something of equal historic importance.
NPR Jerusalem correspondent Daniel Estrin is with us to explain all the implications of this. Hey, Daniel.
Hi, Rachel.
Why do the Golan Heights matter so much?
Well, it's a beautiful place, and to Israel, it's very strategic. It's a rugged plateau. It rises up from the Sea of Galilee. And Syria used to shell Israel from that high point. And in 1967, Israel came under attack, fought the Six-Day War, captured the Golan, later annexed it. And Syria demands it back, and the world and the U.S. never recognized that annexation. And actually, for years, the U.S. helped broker quiet peace talks between Israel and Syria. There was an understanding by Israel that the status of the Golan Heights would be subject to Israeli-Syrian peace talks and an agreement. Even Netanyahu held discussions about this. But then, of course, several years ago, the Syrian civil war erupted. Recently, Iran has been building up its forces in Syria, and in the last month, Israel has been lobbying the Trump administration very hard to endorse Israel keeping the Golan as necessary for security.
So, I mean, what does this mean for any potential peace deal? I mean, the Trump administration has been pretty forthright about its very large ambitions of peace in the Middle East. Does this just upend all that? I mean, they clearly think it doesn't.
Well, strategically, this could be risky. Former U.S. peace negotiator Dennis Ross gave an interview to an Israeli paper, and he says he thinks it might make it harder for Trump to get Arab countries to support his promised Israeli-Palestinian peace plan. George W. Bush's former ambassador to Israel, Daniel Kurtzer, testified before Congress last year on this question of the Golan Heights. He advised against recognizing Israel's annexation. He said Israel has always left the door open to an ultimate peace deal with Syria that could somehow involve the Golan Heights, and this could hurt that. And other analysts are arguing, well, this decision might make it harder for the U.S. to stand up to Russia's annexation of Crimea. And one more interesting point, in Israel, this is breathing life into a much more controversial annexation idea that senior government ministers are backing, and that is that Israel should annex the West Bank.
Also, the timing of this is interesting. Israel's getting ready for elections, right? 3 weeks away.
You're right. I mean, if you look at all the problems in the Middle East today, the Israeli sovereignty question over the Golan Heights is not really the pressing issue. No one is expecting Israel to leave the Golan anytime soon. So the timing is very key here. This Golan decision is a political gift for Netanyahu. So is his trip to the White House next week. Netanyahu hopes this will carry him to re-election in what has shaped up to be a very, very tough race.
Yet another move underscoring the closeness of that relationship, too, between President Trump and President Netanyahu. Daniel Estrin for us, NPR's correspondent in Jerusalem. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So the man who is leading those efforts we mentioned to broker a Middle East peace deal is the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Kushner is now under pressure for something that sounds a little bit familiar, using a private email account to conduct a government business.
House Democrats are asking if Kushner violated federal record-keeping rules. Chairman Elijah Cummings has the same question about the president's daughter Ivanka, by the way. Cummings asserts, and he cites Kushner's own lawyer as the source here, that Kushner has been using the messaging service WhatsApp as well as private email to communicate with foreign leaders, which brings to mind a famous chant. They're saying lock her up. During his presidential campaign and as recently as a few weeks ago, the president's supporters were demanding jail for Hillary Clinton over her use of a private email server.
All right, we've got NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith with us this morning. Hey, Tam.
Good morning.
So there are a lot of details in the House Oversight Committee's letter. What are the specific accusations, as you understand them, against Jared Kushner?
Right. And a big part of this letter is just the backstory, because this investigation began back in March of 2017 when Republicans controlled the Oversight Committee and the House of Representatives. And it's been going on since then. This letter expresses a lot of frustration about the White House not cooperating. And it cites, as Steve said, Jared Kushner's lawyer, also happens to be Ivanka Trump's lawyer, Abby Lowell. And in this letter from Elijah Cummings to the White House, it says that Lowell confirmed that Jared Kushner has used and continues to use WhatsApp as part of his official White House duties. It says that Ivanka Trump is not forwarding official business done on her private email account to her government account. This is all about records keeping. And also alleges that Steve Bannon and an early National Security Council deputy, KT McFarland, used personal email accounts, including an AOL account, to discuss a proposed transfer of nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia.
Which is a significant national security issue.
That is a significant
That's not
national
just setting up a
security
meeting
issue.
here and there. Do you want to go to lunch? That's a substantive issue.
Right. And so that is what the committee is alleging.
So how is Jared Kushner, KT McFarland for that matter, or anyone in the White House responding to this?
So the official word from the White House is that they have received the letter and here's the line. As with all properly authorized oversight requests, the White House will review the letter and will provide a reasonable response in due course. What is more notable is what comes from Abby Lowell, the lawyer for Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. And he says that Cummings' claims are not completely accurate and are being misreported. He says that when he was asked about Kushner using WhatsApp, he told the committee that he didn't know that topic was on the agenda and that the best place to ask those questions was the White House. And he says that he never said Jared Kushner's communications with foreign officials or leaders, that Jared Kushner's communications were with officials or foreign leaders, just they were with some people.
So what do you make of this and what it says about how the White House is going to deal with these investigations by House Democrats? I mean, this isn't the first time we've heard this line from them, right?
No, to me, the most telling line from Cummings' letter to the White House was this. He says, the White House has not produced a single piece of paper to the committee in the 116th Congress in this or any other investigation, which is to say that this ongoing series of investigations is it's just not very friendly.
Yeah, not very friendly. Lots of words we can use to describe that. Not
Yes.
so much cooperative. NPR's Tamara Keith, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
The United Kingdom was scheduled to leave the European Union 1 week from today.
That would have meant potentially crashing out without any agreement to replace the intricate mechanisms of the European Union, damaging Britain's economy, damaging Europe's economy, causing havoc at the borders. So Prime Minister Theresa May asked the EU for an extension to come up with some plan that she can get through her parliament. And last night, after an 8-hour summit, the EU said, okay.
So we will turn to NPR's Frank Langfitt, our man on all things Brexit in London. Hi, Frank.
Good morning, Rachel.
What exactly did the EU agree to?
Well, they said a couple of things. They said if a prime minister can get her Brexit plan through Parliament, she can have an extension until May 22nd. But if she can't, the UK only has until April 12th to come up with a new plan or walk away from the EU with no deal.
Why April 12th?
It's an important date. The reason is that's when you have to field, if you're a country inside the EU, you have to field candidates for the European parliamentary elections that are coming up in May. What the EU is basically saying to the UK is, if you're going to stay in, then field candidates. If not, you've got to come up with something else or go without a deal. And so April 12th, now the new cliff edge.
Why? I mean, let's talk about this from the perspective of the EU. They are, I think it's fair to say they're frustrated with how difficult this has been.
I think that's way too soft. I think they are completely exasperated, shocked by what's happened here in the UK.
So why did they grant the extension?
They're pragmatic, Rachel. They know that the prime minister will have a hard time next week trying to get this Brexit deal through. And they also knew, as Steve just mentioned, if she failed, they're going to crash out on the 29th. That's just a mess for everybody, and certainly would be even more humiliation for the UK. So at least they wanted to give them some breathing space, but not too much.
But I still don't understand how a delay, no matter how short or long, how it makes any difference. I mean, they've been negotiating this for 2 years.
I think they want to give them one last chance to see basically what, if anything, she can do. And it also would give them a little bit of a chance to maybe manage a no deal, in the sense that if there is no deal, maybe there's a little bit more time to make that a little less chaotic. But the real question is, can she get anything through next week? And people are not optimistic. If you remember, just earlier this week, the prime minister went on national television. She actually insulted the very members of parliament she desperately needs to get to back her deal. She basically blamed them for the failures and said she was with the people. And
Talk about people being frustrated. Theresa May is real frustrated right now.
She is. I mean, there's sort of frustration all over the United Kingdom political class. But last night, European Council President Donald Tusk, he said, here are the options. If she can't get the deal through, they either have to prepare to leave without a deal, cancel Brexit, or accept a long extension. But basically, by mid-April, no more fence sitting.
What's going on with people you talk to? I mean,
they hate it.
So over this.
They really, really hate it. They don't want. It's hard to interview people on this topic, yeah. Rachel. They just sort of roll their eyes or just want to walk away from you. There was a poll that came out this week by Sky Data that said 90% of people say the way the UK has handled Brexit is a national humiliation. That number seems low to me.
NPR's Frank Langfitt in London. Frank, thanks as always. We appreciate it.
Happy to do it, Rachel.
Since the beginning of his administration, President Trump has been resolute when it comes to one particular phrase: no collusion. It was special counsel Robert Mueller's job, in part, to find that out.
Now the special counsel's investigation is over. Trump and his White House now believe they have finally been exonerated, even though on the point of obstruction of justice, the report says exactly the opposite. On Sunday, though, the Attorney General, William Barr, sent his summary of Mueller's findings to Congress 2 days after receiving it himself. And the same day, the president had this to say in Florida before boarding Air Force One.
It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction and none whatsoever.
The president there highlighting William Barr, the Attorney General's conclusion that the special counsel found no evidence that the presidential campaign had conspired with Russia to influence the election.
But the issue of obstruction of justice is more complicated. In his 4-page letter to Congress, the Attorney General stated that Mueller did not draw a conclusion one way or the other on whether President Trump or anyone in his White House interfered during the investigation. And Democratic leaders in the House are not satisfied. They want the full Mueller report to be made public. So what does all this mean for the president, for Congress, for the Department of Justice, for the country? A lot of big questions to tackle, and we have a whole team to do it with us. NPR Justice correspondent Carrie Johnson. We have Aisha Roscoe, who covers the White House for NPR, and we have congressional correspondent Susan Davis. Hello to all of you. What a busy time.
Yeah, hi there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Carrie, let me start with you. I mean, you spent much of the weekend getting ready for and then looking over this letter from the Attorney General. I mean, 2 years, the slogan from the White House, no collusion. Is that essentially what this investigation has found?
Important to point out, David, we still do not have the full report from the special counsel, Robert Mueller.
Right.
Instead, we have some very brief written conclusions written by the Attorney General, Bill Barr. But Barr does include a partial quote from Mueller. The investigation did not establish members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. In other words, Russia interfered, but no American tied to the Trump campaign knowingly coordinated with the Russian government, even though Russians had dozens of contacts with people in the Trump orbit in 2016.
Okay, well, take me then through this obstruction of justice question, because it seemed like Mueller left that question open when it comes to President Trump. But then the Attorney General is now saying that even though the question was open from the special counsel, he's not going to charge the president. So explain the reasoning here.
This is the most intriguing part of this story to me. The Attorney General says the special counsel didn't make a call one way or another about whether the president should be charged for obstructing justice. The special counsel report does say, and this is a quote, "While this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him." Instead, for reasons I still don't fully understand, the Attorney General stepped in and answered this question. He said no to charging the president. And here's why. The AG says he considered the fact the president was not involved in any underlying crime, the conspiracy over Russian interference. And the Attorney General also points out a lot of what President Trump did, like firing the FBI Director Jim Comey, a lot of that was done in public, out in the open. But I've been talking with lawyers all night long, former Justice Department officials, Democrats and Republicans, and they say this looks a little strange. You can still be guilty of obstruction if there was no underlying crime. Doing things out in the open like Trump did doesn't matter for many legal purposes. And they don't understand why Mueller has decided not to answer that question. There's an open issue of whether he wanted Congress to answer that question, and the Attorney General and DOJ stepped in anyway.
A lot more to dig into, it sounds like.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, Aisha, let's bring you into this conversation. Clearly, the White House is celebrating, dare we say, crowing a bit. What's the president and his team saying? What are the president and his team saying this morning?
Well, they are saying that this is a complete exoneration for the president. Now, obviously, as Carrie was just mentioning, there are still questions out there, especially when it comes to obstruction. But this is a huge win for the president. It's been a cloud over his presidency. If this probe had went another way, it really would have raised some existential questions about his administration. So this is a big deal. But even though he feels, President Trump feels like he's been exonerated, he's still attacking the validity of the probe. Here's what he said after Barr's report was released.
This was an illegal takedown that failed.
Wow.
Yes.
So not just celebrating the fact that the conclusions bend in his favor, now he's suggesting that this was an illegal investigation to begin with?
From the beginning, and he's saying that the quote other side should be looked at. That will likely mean Democrats and kind of his opponents. And so this is something where he is taking a victory lap, but he's not exactly kind of now saying that Mueller is a great guy.
Right. It was a witch hunt then, and he's come up with a way to continue to criticize it, even though the overarching conclusions say that, what the White House was looking for, that there was no collusion with Russia.
Yes.
Sue Davis, let me bring you in here. The so-called victory lap, the president coming out and saying total exonerations. Are Republicans fully behind that message and that strategy with this president going forward, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think Republicans on Capitol Hill characterize this as a vindication of the president, echoing his no collusion, no obstruction lines. The top Republicans on the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, Doug Collins of Georgia in the House, Lindsey Graham in the Senate, essentially called on Democrats to rethink their investigations into this administration, to move on to other issues. Graham said in a statement that the cloud has been lifted over this presidency. Now, I mean, again, to be clear, the letter said that the president was not legally exonerated. But in the political orbit, I think a lot of Republicans see this as a political exoneration and very much rallying behind the president.
So what do you do if you're Democrats now? I mean, Democrats, they just took over the House. They just started, leading these committees and saying it's time to investigate. It's time to hold this president accountable. Now you have this report come out. You have Republicans saying like, hey, the cloud's been lifted. Let's move on to more important topics. What kind of position are Democrats in right now?
Well, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in a joint statement made clear again that the principal findings alone are not enough. They want to see the full report, although I will say that a lot of Republicans and many in the House have echoed that call. There's not a big pushback from Republicans, especially now that they've seen the principal findings, that they would be happy to see a more full release of the report. Jerry Nadler, the head of the Judiciary Committee, still wants Barr to testify. The chairman made clear yesterday they're going to continue these lines of investigation. House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff did allude to one of the big fights coming on TV yesterday.
This report is going to have to be made public, and of equal importance, the underlying evidence is going to have to be shared with Congress, because that evidence not only goes to the issue of criminality, but it also goes to the issue of compromise.
The fight over the underlying documents. Democrats want to see every piece of evidence that Robert Mueller looked at to draw his conclusions. They're probably not going to get all of that because some of it is not subjected to release and there's going to be other fights. Clearly, they're going to keep going. I do think Democrats have to be very aware of the fact that the president has just been given, a very clear win in a lot of ways. And if they continue to pursue this path, they do run the risk of looking like they are on a political fishing expedition.
Well, Carrie Johnson, let me bring you in here. The whole question of whether the entire report will be released, whether the Attorney General might be called to testify before Congress, but what is likely to happen?
Well, the Attorney General says he's going to be reviewing, along with Special Counsel Bob Mueller, the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, this underlying report. They need to scrub the report for any grand jury material, any material that would implicate several ongoing investigations, and also for classification issues, sources, and methods. But AG Bill Barr seems to suggest he's planning to release something longer. It may take a while given that process. And the other thing we should point out is that Barr is very likely to have to testify. It's unclear at this point whether the special counsel who's winding down his responsibilities will also be called to Capitol Hill as well.
Well, there was a lot of mention in this letter to an important question about whether to release this to the public, being whether a lot of what is in Mueller's report has bearing on other legal investigations happening. What else is out there still right now?
There is a lot, David. The Southern District of New York, federal prosecutors in Manhattan have had this ongoing campaign finance investigation involving the president's former fixer, Michael Cohen, and payments to women who alleged they had affairs with Trump, trying to cover that up allegedly during the 2016 campaign. There are investigations in Brooklyn, New York, in Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, Virginia, and elsewhere. And then, David, there are also state officials on the trail of the Trump organization and some people in Trump's orbit, like his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. State officials in New York in particular are hot and heavy on those investigations. No sign they're going to be ending anytime soon.
I want to close by picking up on something that Sue mentioned, that this may not be a legal exoneration, but perhaps a political one for the president, which is important because 2020 is very close. So I guess I would ask Sue and Aisha, I mean, what are the political ramifications for the election? I mean, first, Aisha, just what does this mean for the president going forward? What does that mean for his base? How does he parlay this into a re-election?
Trump is going to use this to fuel his base, and he's going to use this as further evidence that the media and the Democrats, this idea that they were all out to get him, that he's being treated unfairly. And when you talk about other investigations, what he's going to do is say that look at what happened with this one, look at what happened with this investigation. All these other investigations are the same and that they're false. So this is what he's going to kind of hammer on. I think we're going to hear a lot about how he was cleared and there was no collusion, and he always said that.
Sue?
I think that the Democratic field was competitive before the letter. I think it still is. I think Democrats not run on Russia as much as the president says they do. And there will be changes, but it's still a very competitive presidential election.
All right, NPR's Susan Davis. We had Aisha Roscoe with us as well, and NPR's Carrie Johnson. All three of you, thank you so much for your work and for sharing your reporting this morning. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Happy to
Thank you.
The investigation is over. Robert Mueller says no collusion. Attorney General William Barr says no obstruction. Democrats, though, want to see the proof.
Yes, 6 Democratic committee chairs in the House wrote a letter to Barr on Monday telling him that his 4-page summary of the Mueller report is not sufficient. They are demanding that the entire report and investigation materials be released by next week. President Trump himself said it wouldn't bother him if the report was made public, but he is not taking the results and turning the page, not at all. Now he wants to turn the questions back on the questioners.
There are a lot of people out there that have done some very, very evil things, very bad things, I would say treasonous things against our country.
NPR's lead political editor, Domenico Montanaro, is with us this morning. Hi, Domenico.
Good morning, Rachel.
Is there going to be a fight over this, releasing these materials?
There's at least going to be some level of a fight. Democrats believe they have the public on their side in at least calling for transparency. You know, they want more to be released, the Mueller report. You've heard Democratic presidential candidates, for example, calling for the full report to be released. You'll probably still hear that. Here was Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer yesterday talking about how that was something even Republicans support.
President Trump has said even before the report came out and repeatedly afterwards, several times, he supported passage of the House resolution. He supports making it public. So have a good number of my Republican colleagues, a whole bunch.
You know, he's talking about there, the House passed unanimously. It was a non-binding resolution to release the report, but it was blocked in the Senate.
Right. So, meanwhile, the House Intelligence Committee was supposed to have this hearing with this guy named Felix Sater, who was a negotiator for the Trump Tower project in Moscow. They were supposed to have it this week. It has now been postponed. How come?
Well, the committee cited the Mueller probe as a reason for delaying the Sater hearing. A spokesman told NPR that with the focus on the efforts to try to get more information on the Mueller investigation, quote, we are postponing Mr. Sater's open interview. So clearly Democrats are struggling somewhat with a way forward. You know, some want to move on to policy initiatives and differences with the president, things like healthcare, wages, pay equity, the kinds of kitchen table issues that helped get them elected in 2018.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we heard the president say in that clip earlier. He referenced that people out there, I'm quoting now, have done some very evil things. I would say treasonous things. Did the White House clarify who exactly he is speaking about?
Well, the president and Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham, Graham called for a special counsel to look into this. And they're about things like the Mueller probe's roots, how the FBI handled the investigation, Democratic officials who floated the idea that there was evidence of collusion of the Trump campaign with Russia. And
so it's not enough
seems...
to just take the conclusions of the Mueller report. Now they want to go after the inception of the whole thing.
Right. And that's a lot different than past presidents. Think about President Reagan during the Iran-Contra crisis. Think about Bill Clinton after impeachment. Both were happy to drop those issues and move on. Of course, this effort kind of seems to be getting a little bit ahead of things, given all that we have at this point is a 4-page summary of Mueller's findings from an attorney general who Trump appointed. He's somebody who has previously said Mueller was going too far in seeking answers from the president about an investigation that, frankly, the president was not exonerated from when it comes to obstruction. So, it's really something Democrats are going to want more answers on, and Republicans looking to turn the tables.
And an election imminent. NPR's Domenico Montanaro. Domenico, thanks. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, a familiar sound rang out in the Gaza Strip last night.
Yeah, it's the sound of Israeli rockets targeting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Those airstrikes continued overnight, and so did rocket fire from Gaza towards Israel. This round of violence began yesterday when a rocket from Gaza hit a house in Israel and lightly wounded 7 people. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu cut his trip to Washington short to return to Israel. Here's what he had to say while he was at the White House.
I have a simple message to Israel's enemies. We will do whatever we must do to defend our people and defend our state.
And we should say all this comes at a critical time. We're just 2 weeks away from Israeli elections.
NPR's correspondent in Jerusalem, Daniel Estrin, is with us this morning to talk about all this. Hey, Daniel.
Hi, Rachel.
Why this escalation now?
Tensions have been building on the Gaza border now for a while, actually. For the last year, Hamas has been leading mass protests on the Israeli border fence to pressure Israel to relax its blockade on Gaza to help make life better for the 2 million Palestinians who live there, who face power cuts and soaring unemployment and other crises. But those protests on the border have not brought those results, and Hamas is under pressure from their own people, from Palestinians in Gaza. There were major street protests in Gaza recently that Hamas quashed, and maybe yesterday's rocket fire was trying to put the ball back in Israel's court.
So there were these reports that a kind of ceasefire mediated by Egypt had been reached. Where is that at?
Well, Hamas said Egypt had brokered that ceasefire at 10 p.m. last night, but fire did not cease, and about 30 rockets were fired toward Israel after that, and there were air raid sirens in southern Israel overnight. Israeli airstrikes also
so not so
with
much
7
a ceasefire.
Palestinians. Not so much of a ceasefire, and an Israeli cabinet minister saying, nope, we will continue hitting Hamas.
So, I mean, as these things go, if you look back at patterns, can you sense whether or not this is something that's going to escalate further?
Well, I think Hamas has an interest in keeping up the heat here to pressure Israel to reach some kind of agreement on improved conditions in Gaza, but not too much heat. The rocket fire from Gaza last night was limited. And then on Israel's side, it's saying, well, yes, we're in reinforcing troops. We've hit some key Hamas targets. We've canceled schools near Gaza in southern Israel, so signaling that it could be prepping for a few days of fighting. But the Israeli airstrikes were limited too. So I think neither side wants to go to war, but neither side wants things to calm down just yet.
So David mentioned this, that Israel is holding elections just a couple of weeks from now. And the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had been in Washington. Then because of this violence, he cut that trip short. I guess the question I'm getting to is how is the Prime Minister's overall Gaza policy viewed in Israel?
Not many Israelis are happy with how he's handled Gaza. Many say he's appeasing Hamas, trying to quiet the protests on the Gaza border. And Netanyahu now has an interest as he fights for re-election to show he's tough on Gaza.
NPR's Daniel Estrin in Jerusalem for us. Daniel, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, before we begin this next story and conversation, we want to give you advanced warning that we are going to spend the next few minutes talking about suicide. Specifically, Jeremy Richmond, the father of a Sandy Hook shooting victim who has been found dead in Newtown, Connecticut. He is believed to have taken his own life.
Yeah, Richmond's daughter, Avielle, was one of the 20 young children killed in the school shooting. After Avielle's death, Jeremy became an activist, and he spoke with NPR about his work and about his daughter in 2017.
I think she's everywhere. She's in the air we breathe. She's in my mind always, and she's in my heart. She's in our children, in our spirits, and she's everywhere, but nowhere that I can squeeze and hold.
Jeremy's body was discovered yesterday in his office, and this is just days after the deaths of 2 students who were survivors of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida. Both of those deaths are also being treated as apparent suicides. Multiple apparent suicides in 2 communities affected by school shootings. I mean, this may sound like more than just a coincidence.
Right. So we've got NPR health correspondent Ritu Chatterjee in our studios this morning. Ritu covers mental health. Hi, thanks for coming in.
Hi, Rachel.
So there is this concept, this idea known as a so-called suicide contagion, which is sort of a horrific notion. Can you explain what it actually means, and is that connected to what we're seeing right now?
So suicide contagion is this phenomenon where one suicide then causes a spike in other suicides. So knowing about a suicide death in your family, in your community, or hearing about the death of, say, a celebrity in the news or somebody remote to you increases the risk of somebody who's already struggling with suicidal thoughts. So, for example, in the 4 months after Robin Williams died, there was nearly a 10% spike in the suicide rate in the country. And there was a published study about this. But these 3 recent suicides, it's too early to say whether this is a contagion. It could be. Experts I spoke to said it's hard to say just yet. But one expert specifically told me, this was Madeline Gould, who studies suicide contagion. She's at Columbia University. She said that the second suicide in Parkland may have been influenced by the first because teens and young people are particularly vulnerable to this contagion.
So you mentioned that just having proximity to an apparent suicide, hearing about it, can play a role. Here we are in the media talking about this. I mean, what responsibility does the media bear? I mean, how much can discussing things like this affect people who are already at risk?
So it's not so much just talking about suicides, but how we report an individual death. So if we talk about a death, the means of a death is difficult. That can cause, but talking about suicide is inevitable, is bad, but because suicide is preventable.
What can communities like Parkland and Newtown, other places that experience mass shooting, do to prevent individuals from acting on these feelings?
Look out for people who are struggling and help them get help. There is a national helpline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. That's a good place to start.
NPR's Ritu Chatterjee for us this morning. Thank you, Ritu.
Thank you, Rachel.
The head of the Federal Aviation Administration is expected to get some tough questions today from members of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, lawmakers are probably going to press the FAA's acting administrator, Daniel Elwell, on his agency's action, or maybe lack of action, rather, in the days after the second of 2 crashes involving the Boeing 737 MAX. The most recent was that Ethiopian Airlines jet that crashed, killing all 157 people on board. That happened earlier this month. A number of countries grounded all 737 MAX planes the very next day. That was not the case here in the U.S. The FAA waited 3 days before grounding those planes. Here's Elwell explaining that decision to NPR.
Nobody had data to act on it. It was all conjecture. And in aviation, the FAA in the U.S. has always acted on data.
Let's bring in NPR's business reporter, Jim Zaroli, who is going to be covering this hearing. Hi, Jim.
Good morning.
All right, so what do we expect? How tense is this going to get?
This is being conducted by the Aviation and Space Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee, and they're going to be hearing from Elwell, also the head of the National Transportation Safety Board, and the Transportation Department Inspector General, and they're going to be talking about, the whole process of how this 737 MAX was certified, the steps the government took to stop the plane from flying after the crashes. Both the planes went down in very similar circumstances right after takeoff, and in both cases, something appeared to go wrong with the computer system that was supposed to stabilize the plane.
Well, and one of the looming questions I know lawmakers and a lot of other people following the story have had is whether Boeing, I mean, this major American company, whether it's too close to the government, whether the FAA might have thought about Boeing's potential, troubles if they grounded these planes. I mean, I'm sure those questions are going to come up, right?
Yeah, I think we can expect questions about Boeing's efforts to train the pilots. Did they did they go far enough? Did these, in both cases, the planes were behaving erratically, the nose was dropping, and the pilots were trying to counter that, but tragically they weren't able to. I think, in general, the hearing will focus just on how well the FAA is able to regulate Boeing. Has it left too many decisions about safety up to the company itself? Should it be doing more? And also, does it have the resources to do more? I mean, air travel has just gotten so much more common over the years, and there are people who say the FAA's budget hasn't kept up. So just a lot of tough questions about the running of the FAA and what its responsibility is right now.
I know we heard a little bit of tape from Elwell a few minutes ago saying that, his agency is one that just acts on data and bases decisions on data. Is that the essential message we're expecting to hear from him today, or will his message change?
Well, we have obtained a copy of his opening statement, so we know, and basically he's going to talk about how the FAA certifies planes as safe. He's also going to talk about the two crashes. He says after the first crash in Indonesia, the FAA ordered planes to instruct pilots and how to respond to stabilization problems. And after the second crash, it looked into the data. It didn't support grounding the plane. So at least until more information came in. So senators are likely to ask why it took the U.S. so much longer to ground the planes than other countries did.
Yeah, putting passengers in this country in the air when others were not flying on those planes anymore. All right, NPR's Jim Zaroli reporting for us. Jim, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, in a really stunning and controversial move, prosecutors have dropped all of the charges against Empire actor Jussie Smollett, who had been accused of staging a phony hate crime.
Yeah, Jussie Smollett claimed earlier this year that two masked men attacked him in downtown Chicago, yelling racist and homophobic slurs. A grand jury then concluded that the attack was, in fact, a hoax. Smollett was potentially going to face prison time for this. Now there is this deal where the actor will do community service and the charges will all be dropped, as you noted. The city's police chief and the mayor are both furious about this decision.
This is just an incredible turn in what has been a weird story to follow. NPR's Cheryl Corley has been following it from Chicago. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, good morning.
Just remind us about some of the details of this case and how we arrived here.
Well, this case actually began in late January. That's when Jussie Smollett said that he was attacked, and there was this huge outpouring of sympathy and support for him, and police began investigating it as a hate crime. But this has been such a huge case of, was Smollett actually the person who orchestrated this attack or not? And things started to change after police went through lots of video from security cameras. They ended up interviewing two brothers who said that Smollett paid them to take part in the attack. And Superintendent Eddie Johnson blasted Smollett, calling his story a hoax that the actor set up because he was unhappy with his salary on Empire and staged the attack for publicity. So as you mentioned, a grand jury did charge him with 16 counts of disorderly conduct, accusing him of filing a false police report. And those are the charges that were dropped yesterday after Smollett agreed to give his $10,000 bond to the city in addition to the community service you mentioned. And here's what he had to say yesterday.
This has been an incredibly difficult time, honestly one of the worst of my entire life. But I'm a man of faith, and I'm a man that has knowledge of my history, and I would not bring my family, our lives, or the movement through a fire like this. I just wouldn't.
And so now Jussie Smollett has a clean slate.
Rachel mentioned that the police chief, the mayor, are really unhappy with this decision. Why?
Well, not just unhappy, they were pretty angry and not taking it very well at all. First, they felt blindsided. They didn't know before the court hearing that prosecutors were actually going to drop the charges. They learned about it while a graduation ceremony for new police recruits was underway yesterday. And second, they still believe that Jussie Smollett orchestrated a hoax. And they point to the grand jury, which listened to testimony and came back with that indictment. Last month, Police Superintendent Johnson said Smollett had dragged Chicago's reputation through the mud. Yesterday, he said that justice was just not served. And Mayor Rahm Emanuel called the decision to drop the charges a whitewash of justice. And here's more of what he had to say.
This is an unbelievable, not just whitewash of justice, this is a person now who's been let off scot-free with no sense of accountability of the moral and ethical wrong of his actions.
Cheryl, I just wonder, I mean, as people in the city of Chicago have followed this whole thing, could this have an impact on people who, I don't know, might think twice about coming forward and reporting a hate crime in the future?
Well, yeah. Many people suspect that might be the case, that this case might have a very chilling effect on that, with people afraid to report for fear that they just won't be believed at all.
NPR's Cheryl Corley in Chicago. Cheryl, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, the founder and the all-female staff of the Vatican Women's Magazine have abruptly resigned, citing what they call a climate of distrust.
Their publication has gotten a lot of attention for their recent work exposing the sexual abuse of nuns by priests. Those stories led to the rise of #NunsToo, playing off the Me Too movement. In a letter of resignation to the Pope, the editorial board of this magazine wrote that they believe there is a Vatican campaign trying to discredit them and put them under the direct control of men.
All right, we have NPR's Sylvia Poggioli on the line from Rome. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, David.
So tell me more about this magazine first, if you can, and what prompted this abrupt decision to resign.
The magazine's called Women Church World. It's the monthly supplement to the official Vatican daily L'Osservatore Romano, and it was created 7 years ago by Lucetta Scarafia. In her final editorial, she said the new editor of the Osservatore Romano, who arrived in December, had published articles in the main paper that were in contrast with the women's supplements editorial line. And she wrote an open letter to Pope Francis saying, "We are throwing in the towel because we feel surrounded by a climate of distrust and progressive delegitimization. We believe there are no longer the conditions to continue our collaboration with L'Osservatore Romano." She added, "It seems there's a return to the antiquated and arid custom of choosing women considered trustworthy from on high under the direct control of men." But in a statement, the paper's new editor, Andrea Monda, denied the charges that he had tried to interfere in the supplement.
Tell me more about the woman who created this magazine, Lucetta Scarafia.
She's a history professor at Rome University and a mother. She describes herself as a feminist, but she has towed the line on official doctrine. For example, she opposes the idea of women priests. But with an editorial staff of 8 women, that includes nuns and women theologians, the supplement shook the male-dominated world of the Vatican in introducing a women's perspective and dealing with topics that had always been taboo in the Vatican. Last year, they published an article denouncing the servitude of nuns to clergy. It said they work for close to nothing, to cook and clean for bishops and cardinals. And Scott was asked recently about the Pope's description of the church as a woman. She said, "We don't want to be turned into metaphors, but be recognized and listened to."
You've talked to her before, right, in some of your reporting?
Yeah, we talked about her article last month that caused an uproar. It denounced the abuse of nuns by priests and the added trauma of raped nuns who are forced to have abortions or become outcasts when they give birth to a child. She had spoken to hundreds of nuns from all over the world. And the article, in fact, sparked a sort of #NunsToo discussion, and it prompted Pope Francis to acknowledge that abuse of nuns by clergy is a problem, and he vowed to do something about it. Another member of the church I spoke to, Sister Catherine Aubin, a French Dominican nun who teaches theology at a university in Rome, was equally outspoken when I asked how women are treated inside the Vatican.
Siamo inosservate, invisibili.
She said, "We are unobserved, invisible, ignored, and not respected."
Wow. Powerful language. NPR's Sylvia Poggioli reporting for us in Rome. Sylvia, thanks as always.
You're welcome.
The United States caught so many people at the border this week, the Department of Homeland Security says it hardly knows what to do.
Yeah, officials spoke after 2 extraordinary days of apprehensions at the border. The annual flow of migrants to the U.S. remains well below historic highs, but it has been rising. On 2 separate days this week, federal agents apprehended more than 4,000 people crossing without authorization. That is the highest daily total in 15 years. CPB Commissioner Kevin McAleenan says it's part of a busy month.
With 55,000 families, including 40,000 children, expected to enter the process this month, we are doing everything we can to simply avoid a tragedy in a CBP facility. But with these numbers, with the types of illnesses we're seeing at the border, I fear that it's just a matter of time.
NPR's John Burnett is in San Antonio. He's covered the border for years. John, good morning.
Morning, Steve.
We just gave a bunch of numbers, but what do those numbers feel like when you're near the border?
You know, I covered immigration in the borderlands for a really long time, as you know, and I've just never heard this kind of doom and gloom coming from officials. Right now, I'm at this gathering.
John Burnett, I just want to mention something happened to your phone line. We're unable to hear anything that you're saying. If we can try that one more time. There we go. Okay. Go for it, John. What's happening? What's it feel like there?
So I've covered immigration in the borderlands for a long time, and I've never heard this kind of pessimism coming from officials. I'm at this gathering of immigration bigwigs, and they can't find enough superlatives to describe the situation at the border. The unabated crisis, we're overwhelmed, it's unsustainable. Kevin McAleenan, the commissioner who we just heard from, said the breaking point has arrived this week, and if current trends continue, now that the weather is warming up, their in-house forecast is looking at up to 150,000 migrants being arrested a month for the next 3 months.
I want to follow up on a thing that we heard McAleenan say there. He said we're doing everything we can to simply avoid a tragedy in a CBP facility. Do I understand him to say they don't have proper facilities to detain everyone and they're going to end up in unhealthy or even deadly conditions?
Well, I mean, Steve, the Border Patrol stations were set up for single males, and so they're very Spartan. I mean, they've been described as dog kennels by some of those who've stayed in them. We've learned that some of these stations are 2 and 3 times over capacity. I mean, out of El Paso yesterday, we saw pictures. They were locking them up in holding pens outside under a bridge, waiting to process them. And in El Paso and up and down the border, the Border Patrol is ready to release thousands of these immigrants directly to church-run shelters in the community. And if they don't have any room, they're going to be on the streets.
Okay, so that is one answer to this, to turn over some of the migrants to private organizations to the extent that they can. But is there any other way to help this situation?
Well, you know, this administration has been asking for help from the Pentagon since it came into office. There are National Guard down on the border. Now they're active duty. And so the Border Patrol is making a request for assistance for even more help from the Pentagon, but this time directly to help processing the immigrants. Remember, the Defense Department didn't want to have their soldiers in direct contact with immigrants. Now, Customs and Border Protection is saying, hey, guys, we need help transporting and doing the paperwork for this crush of immigrants. We need your soldiers to pitch in directly.
If there is no way to hold people, is it legal in some cases to simply load them on buses and ship them back to Mexico where they seem to have come from?
They cannot do that. They cannot send them back into Mexico. They have to let them actually apply for asylum. And that's the frustrating thing for agents is that even this, this wall that this administration has been touting for so long, it doesn't make a difference. And I've been at this trade show with all of these immigration officials down here, and they're showing all these high-tech equipment like drones and pole-mounted cameras, and none of that would actually stop the immigrants from coming across because they're not trying to evade officers. They're crossing the river and they're surrendering to Border Patrol officers. So it's a unique crisis they're facing down here.
NPR's John Burnett, thanks so much.
You bet, Steve.
Okay, not for the first time. A federal judge has rejected an effort to put pressure on some of the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, the judge rejected plans by 2 states to add a work requirement to Medicaid. That's the health insurance program for people near or below the poverty line. The Trump administration had encouraged states to approve a work requirement, but the judge blocked plans by Kentucky and Arkansas, which did that. In Arkansas alone, 18,000 recipients have lost health coverage since the state began the mandate last summer.
NPR health policy correspondent Allison Kojak has been covering this story. Allison, good morning.
Good morning, Steve.
What exactly were the work requirements?
So people who are adults who are considered, quote, able-bodied, which means not pregnant women, not disabled, would have to work 80 hours a month. And that work could be an actual job, volunteer, go to school or job training. And in addition to actually doing the work, they would have to report into the state exactly what they had done to meet those requirements.
Some people listening will say, okay, well, you ought to try to work as a requirement of having health insurance because other people work. What was the judge's response to that kind of reasoning?
Well, what the judge said is essentially Medicaid, the law that created Medicaid, its goal is only to provide health care to low-income people. It's not about making people work or an anti-poverty program. So when the Obama administration expanded Medicaid to more people under the Affordable Care Act, they declined to allow states to require people to work. But as you mentioned earlier, the Trump administration has been saying, yes, we would like you to ask people to work in exchange for those benefits. This judge said that's not in the law. You can't condition health care on work.
So there was this effort in at least 2 states to use Medicaid as a lever to get people into the workplace. Are there other states that could be affected by this ruling against that practice?
Yeah, there are 15 states who have either had a waiver, one of these requests to impose work requirements on Medicaid beneficiaries, approved, or it's pending. And because the Trump administration had essentially invited states to do this, even those pending ones seemed like they would get approved. Now that's all been tossed up in the air. Unless the Department of Health and Human Services in those states can come up with a rationale that says requiring work actually provides health care, it's unclear that they'll be able to go forward with these.
The firmest solution would be an actual change in the law. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it would have to change the law that created the Medicaid program, because that program, according to this judge, says the purpose of Medicaid is to provide health care, not to lift people out of poverty, which is what the Trump administration has been saying they'd like it to do.
Allison, thanks for the update.
Thanks, Steve.
NPR health policy correspondent Allison Kojak. Wow, an offer by British Prime Minister Theresa May suggests the bad feelings in Britain's parliament. Theresa May offered her colleagues an inducement if they will just do what she wants one time, she promises to resign.
Yeah, the incentive she offered is that if her Brexit deal is approved, she will let someone else take her job. Now, we should remember lawmakers have already rejected that plan 2 times, and in a series of votes last night, lawmakers also rejected every single other plan they could think of. 8 no votes in all. John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, read out the results.
So the noes have it. So the noes have it. So the noes have it.
Frank Langfitt of NPR News, who's been covering this story, it sounds like the noes have it.
It was the night of 8 noes, yes.
Oh, my goodness. So is May likely to get out of this disaster by offering to quit?
Not yet. She made progress, Steve. She picked up at least 24 votes, as far as I can tell. The most significant one was Boris Johnson. He was one of the leaders of the 2016 Brexit referendum campaign. He'd been an intense critic of her deal. He did a U-turn yesterday, said he could support it. Now, it's worth remembering Boris Johnson is widely thought to want the prime minister's job, so her offer was particularly attractive to him. But the big problem for the prime minister still is the Democratic Unionist Party. They provide 10 crucial votes, which gives May's Conservative Party a majority in the parliament. They still say they're not going to vote for her deal. By my count, roughly, it seems like she needs to flip 50 more votes, and she's not there yet.
Let me just remember, Democratic Unionist Party, those are folks in Northern Ireland who are especially affected by the way that Brexit turns out. I'm not sure that I understand what exactly happened yesterday. How did it come to pass that Parliament was voting on 8 different plans, including just holding a second referendum on Brexit?
Yeah, what they did is they seized control in the British parliamentary system. The government, the prime minister, runs the agenda. The parliament took control and they had these 8 different options. And I was surprised by this. I thought one was going to pass. They all went down to defeat. And the government saw this like as a bit of an opportunity to point out, we gave you a chance to do this. You seized control. You failed. You really should take a closer look at our deal. And Stephen Barclay, he's the UK's Brexit secretary. He laid it out in the House of Commons last night like this.
There is no simple way forward. The deal the government has negotiated is a compromise. The results of the process this House has gone through today strengthens our view that the deal the government has negotiated is the best option.
Frank, isn't tomorrow a deadline for Parliament to do something?
Very good memory. It is. They need to get her deal through. Otherwise, they have to come up with a new plan by April 12th, or they will have to leave the EU with no deal, which most people think would be economically very damaging and certainly politically even more damaging to the United Kingdom.
Oh, because the EU gave them until May if they pass something by tomorrow. But if they pass nothing by tomorrow, they've only got like a couple of weeks and they are out.
Indeed. And we still don't have any sense of how they're going to solve this. And we have one day left to get our deal through.
Okay. Bit of suspense. Frank, thanks so much.
Happy to do it, Steve.
NPR's Frank Langfitt.
On this Friday morning, Americans still do not have the Mueller report. A new survey finds an overwhelming majority want it to be public before they decide what to think.
Americans do have a summary by President Trump's Attorney General. In it, William Barr says Russia worked to elect the president. He finds no evidence President Trump's campaign conspired with Russia, and Barr decided not to charge his boss with obstruction of justice. That was enough for the president to celebrate at a campaign rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
The Russia hoax is finally dead. The collusion delusion is over.
NPR's White House correspondent Tamara Keith was at that rally and joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's start with that poll. The president there clearly saying that this is victory in his mind. But what do these new numbers tell us about how the public sees the Mueller report?
Well, 56% now say that Robert Mueller conducted a fair investigation. In fact, Robert Mueller's favorability is going up in large part because of Republicans. Let's get to this big number, though. 75% of people surveyed say the full Mueller report should be made public. That includes a majority of Republicans. 2/3 also say that they want Mueller to testify before Congress, and a similar number say they want Attorney General Bill Barr to testify. Now, interestingly, almost 6 in 10 said that questions still exist, and just 36% say that President Trump is clear of any wrongdoing. Now, I was at this rally. I talked to several Trump supporters as they were heading in, and surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, given these poll numbers, basically every one of them said that they either wanted or would be okay with the Mueller report coming out. He is Jack Corkle. He's 19 years old.
I think he's innocent. I think that it should be released in full. Personally, I thought it was kind of like they laid out the groundwork for it in the previous administration, and Mueller, I think he's an honest guy, and he did the investigation, and I think now everyone should just move forward.
And he was not alone in this. A number of people said similar things.
I was looking on Twitter last night and saw this picture of a guy at that rally who was wearing a no collusion T-shirt, which they've clearly, that was quick response to make some T-shirts after this whole thing. The president also trying to frame this as a victory. Clearly, he sees this as a political opportunity.
Well, the president has been saying no collusion for a long time, but now he has a little bit something to back him up on that. And this was a victory lap last night. And in addition to declaring victory, he was also mocking the congressmen who are leading some of the House committees that are investigating him. And that belittling has a purpose. It is both the president trying to make them pay for what he sees as 2 years of overreach, and it's also him trying to undermine the investigations that still linger. And if all that wasn't clear from the mocking and the nicknames, President Trump also made it quite explicit, saying Democrats are, quote, defrauding the public with this ridiculous BS. And he did not say BS.
At the same time, the White House, the president, They're talking about this, trying to frame it as a win. They're also talking about health care in a way that they haven't before. I mean, clearly seeing this as a potential win for them politically in the election.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing given that 2018, the midterms, Democrats ran on health care and won. The president and his administration are now looking to, as he says, get rid of Obamacare through the courts this time, and then says that Republicans will become the party of great health care, saying there will be a new plan, though it's not clear where that plan is right now.
Haven't seen that.
It doesn't seem to exist.
NPR's Tamara Keith. Thanks, Tam.
You're welcome.
Okay, despite mounting pressure from inside Venezuela and around the world, the sitting president there, Nicolas Maduro, is still holding on to power.
He has heavily armed supporters, of course, both in the military and in paramilitary groups. Maduro is also being helped by a Russian military contingent that is said to have arrived in the capital, Caracas. But none of that seems to be deterring Juan Guaido, the man the United States and most Western states recognize as the legitimate leader now. Guaido declared yesterday that preparations for what he's termed Operation Liberty have begun, although it's unclear what Operation Liberty is.
Ari Shapiro is the host of NPR's All Things Considered, and he has spent the last week on Colombia's border with Venezuela. And he joins us now. Ari, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Rachel. Good to be here.
Just tell us what the situation is at the border.
You know, the city of Cucuta right there on the border is so overcrowded. More than 1 million Venezuelans, have recently crossed into Colombia, and many of them are still in the city of Cucuta. It feels like a place stretched to the breaking point. People there are desperate. Hyperinflation in Venezuela has wiped out the life savings that many of them earned. And so I met a lot of angry young men who told me they have nothing to lose. They're willing to fight. People told me, give me a weapon and I will charge across the country and do what's necessary to try to force Maduro out.
Wow. Tell us more about some of the people that you met.
Okay, well, let's start with the guys who have the most training and experience fighting. Those would be the military defectors. And they are living in this abandoned luxury hotel resort guarded by Colombian police. It's a place that used to be popular with Venezuelan tourists, but of course those tourists are no longer coming. Mm-hmm. These defectors are only allowed out of the hotel a couple hours a day, partly because their Colombian hosts are afraid that the guests might try to spark a war. 4 of those guys agreed to spend their time out of the hotel talking with me. So we met in the ruins of this old cathedral that was destroyed in an earthquake more than a century ago. And the informal leader of the group, this guy named Williams Cancino, told me he and his buddies are just waiting for the order.
Estamos aquí es para atacar contundentemente el régimen dictatorial de Maduro.
We are here to overwhelmingly attack the dictatorial regime of Maduro.
He said the defectors are getting impatient, and he told me if they do not get the green light to attack from Juan Guaido or from the U.S., they might just take action on their own. Some people will say that's just bluster. These guys don't have weapons or money, and the majority of the military still supports Maduro. But the military defectors are not the only ones itching for a fight. There are a lot of people who are getting very impatient.
So not just ex-military, just civilians are ready to start some kind of conflagration?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned disillusioned young men. I heard this from older men, too. At a Catholic soup kitchen that serves up to 8,000 hot meals every day to hungry Venezuelans, I met a 58-year-old construction worker named Luis. He crosses the border every day to get food because he can't find any in Venezuela. And we're only using his first name here because what you are about to hear him say could get him in a lot of trouble back home.
En mi estado, Táchira, están formando.
In my state, armed groups are forming to go confront the government of Nicolás Maduro.
Wow. People are anxious to bring the fight to Maduro. What would happen, Ari, if violence breaks out?
Of course, it's impossible to know for sure, but there are fears that a civil war could become a regional conflict, potentially even a global conflict. We've seen the U.S. and Russia both digging in. The U.S. wants Maduro out. Russia wants him to stay. When I spoke to the Colombian ambassador to the U.S. about this, he told me that his worst fear is that Venezuela could become like another Syria, where armed groups backed by global superpowers fight for dominance. Of course, that would mean millions more Venezuelans flooding out of the country into Colombia. And that exodus is the story that we're going to explore tonight on All Things Considered.
NPR's Ari Shapiro. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you, Rachel.
Let's go to London. Today is yet another crucial day for the future of the United Kingdom and its relationship with the EU. We mean it this time.
So British Prime Minister Theresa May says twice she has brought her Brexit withdrawal agreement before Parliament. Twice it has suffered staggering defeats. Today she tries a third time, possibly the last time, because the European Union has given the UK until tonight to approve the agreement or risk crashing out.
Does the Prime Minister have enough support? Let's ask NPR's Frank Langfitt in London. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Rachel.
So the Prime Minister has been here before. She lost her first vote on her deal by big margins. The second defeat was also big, but less bad. What are her prospects?
Well, Brexit is nothing if not unpredictable, but the odds are still against her. She did pick up some votes this week. James Gray, he's a Brexiteer member of May's Conservative Party. He was actually speaking to Morning Edition yesterday and said he would finally back the Prime Minister's deal. This is what he said.
17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union. We must now deliver on that promise, and the only way we can do that is by supporting the Prime Minister's otherwise obnoxious deal.
But the problem, Rachel, is the opposition Labour Party says they're against this. The Democratic Unionist Party of Northern Ireland also against it. The margin should be closer today, but it's still very challenging for the Prime Minister.
Also, I mean, the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, said that the Prime Minister couldn't bring back her deal unless it was really changed. And it's not so much, is it?
Well, this is hair splitting, frankly. But what she's done is she's brought back one part of the deal, what's called the divorce deal, instead of the divorce deal and sort of an outline on the future relationship with the EU. And Bercow said, OK, this is just we're just voting on one part of it. That makes it different enough. So he's accepting it.
OK, so the stakes, I mean, it sounds so cliche, but it's for real now. I mean, this is kind of the final deal for the UK. This vote is really important, right?
It's hard to imagine she would bring it up for a fourth vote at this point, and she would be crashing through this deadline. What the EU has said is if it does fail tonight, which is the general expectation, then they have until April 12th really to come up with some kind of new plan. So time is very much running out. And what we would do is, if this goes down, we would expect Parliament to come back early next week to debate other options. And one of the options to look for would be some kind of compromise where there might be a customs union still between the EU and the UK so that goods could still travel freely across the borders. And so basically looking for some way out of this. Prime Minister May's against that. We'll see what happens next week.
What happens to her? She's promised to step down if Parliament passed her deal.
She's under so much pressure right now, and certainly if she loses this vote tonight, people don't expect her to last that long.
NPR's Frank Langfitt with the latest on Brexit, reporting from London. Thanks, Frank.
Happy to do it, Rachel.